A year after my wife passed away, I hired an electrician to fix the electrical system in her old factory. While working, he suddenly stopped and looked at me with genuine fear. "Do not open that hidden box on your own," he whispered before packing his tools and leaving the building in a massive hurry. When I finally cracked the heavy steel open and saw what my late wife had hidden inside the concrete wall, my blood ran entirely cold. But before I could even process the massive secret, my children violently kicked the factory doors open. They brought two massive medical orderlies from a state-run psychiatric ward to lock me away forever. I am Desmond Sterling. I am 72 years old, and I spent my entire life working as a heavy machinery mechanic in Atlanta. My late wife Vivian and I lived a very quiet working-class life, or so I deeply believed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The old abandoned textile factory was the only property Vivian absolutely refused to sell. It was a massive, decaying brick building on the industrial outskirts of the city. My children always called it a toxic dump. They hated it. Yesterday afternoon, I was standing alone in the dark basement of that factory. The electrician had removed a large, rusted metal panel that was supposed to house the main breaker box. Instead, there was a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox cemented directly into the structural wall. My hands were shaking slightly as I gripped a heavy iron crowbar. I wedged the metal edge under the steel lid and pushed with all my remaining physical strength. The rusted lock snapped with a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the empty warehouse. I pulled the heavy lid open and a thick cloud of dust filled the air. Inside the dark cavity, I found three specific things. There was a small digital voice recorder. There was a highly encrypted computer hard drive, and resting beneath them was a thick stack of certified corporate bearer bonds. I pulled the heavy paper certificates into the dim light shining through the broken basement windows. I slowly read the heavy black ink printed across the top document. The certificates proved absolute, unrecorded ownership of a massive offshore private equity account. I looked at the final valuation printed at the bottom of the page. The total liquid value was exactly $80 million. My heart completely stopped in my chest. We were never a humble working-class family. My beautiful, quiet wife had been a silent multi-millionaire operating a massive financial empire entirely in the shadows. But before I could even begin to process the magnitude of this extreme generational wealth, my eyes fell on the small digital voice recorder. I pressed the play button. Vivian's voice filled the quiet, dusty factory. She sounded incredibly weak and heartbroken. She had recorded the message just weeks before she passed away from cancer. "Desmond, if you are hearing this, it means I am gone," she whispered, her voice crackling over the small speaker. "You must protect yourself immediately. Our biological children, Terrence and Camille, have been secretly stealing money from our small business accounts for years. But your son-in-law, Preston, and your daughter-in-law, Chelsea, are deeply manipulative and highly dangerous. They are actively planning to lock you away in a facility to seize control of this specific factory. Do not trust our children with a single penny of this wealth. They view you as nothing but a stepping stone for their own absolute greed." A loud, aggressive slamming sound echoed through the warehouse, abruptly cutting off my wife's terrifying warning. The heavy steel sliding doors on the main floor were violently pushed open. The harsh, bright sunlight from the Atlanta afternoon spilled into the dark building. I quickly shoved the voice recorder, the encrypted hard drive, and the thick stack of $80 million bearer bonds deep into the inner pockets of my heavy leather winter jacket. I zipped the jacket up securely just as heavy footsteps began marching down the metal staircase toward the basement. My biological son, Terrence, walked into the room wearing a highly expensive designer suit that he absolutely could not afford. He was 46 years old, but he looked like a terrified, sweating child who was drowning in massive consumer debt. Right behind him was my daughter-in-law, Chelsea. She is a 42-year-old white woman who failed miserably as an interior designer, but constantly acted like she belonged to absolute royalty. She was wearing pristine white designer clothing in a filthy, abandoned factory. She immediately pulled a silk handkerchief out of her expensive purse and covered her nose, looking around the basement with pure, unadulterated disgust. "It smells like absolute toxic garbage in here," Chelsea complained loudly, waving her manicured hand in front of her face. "Desmond, you really need to stop coming to this filthy neighborhood. It is completely unsanitary and dangerous. But I suppose people from your specific background simply do not know how to maintain proper hygiene or valuable property. Her highly racist microaggression hung in the cold air exactly as she intended. She always used those subtle, condescending insults to remind me that she felt vastly superior to our black family. My biological daughter, Camille, trailed closely behind her, completely ignoring my presence to stare blankly at her cell phone. And then my son-in-law, Preston, stepped into the light. Preston is a 45-year-old white hedge fund manager with a reputation for extreme arrogance and deep corporate corruption. He looked around the dirty factory with absolute, pure contempt. He was flanked by two massive, incredibly intimidating men wearing crisp white medical scrubs. They were professional orderlies from a state-run psychiatric ward, and they were holding heavy canvas restraints in their large, muscular hands. Preston did not even bother to greet me. He aggressively slapped a thick legal clipboard down onto a dusty wooden barrel right in front of me. He looked at me as if I was a pathetic, helpless animal. "We are completely done playing these little games," Desmond Preston said, his voice dripping with intense, unearned authority. "You are wandering around an abandoned, toxic building talking to yourself in the dark. It is highly pathetic. This property is becoming a massive financial liability to our family. We have a commercial developer who is actively willing to buy this useless land tomorrow morning for a significant cash payout. You are going to sign this quitclaim deed right now and transfer the total ownership of this factory directly to me and Terrence." I looked at the four of them standing there, completely convinced of their own absolute superiority. I felt the heavy stack of $80 million bearer bonds resting securely against my chest. "What makes you think I would ever sign over my wife's property to you?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely flat. Terrence stepped forward, wiping nervous sweat from his forehead. "Because you no longer have a choice, Dad," he said coldly, trying to sound strong but failing entirely. "You are completely losing your mind. You have severe dementia. We already filed the official medical paperwork with the state. We have two professional orderlies right here, right now. You are going to sign the deed today, or they are going to physically drag you out of this building and permanently relocate you to a locked memory care unit at the state psychiatric hospital. My own biological children were actively plotting to throw me into a literal prison just to steal a factory they thought was worth a little bit of pocket change. They wanted to strip away my fundamental human rights and lock me in a padded room until I died." Preston crossed his arms over his expensive, tailored chest. "If you do not sign the deed right now, old man, I am going to personally make sure they heavily medicate you until you forget your own name." Preston threatened maliciously. "We legally control your medical proxy now. You sign the paper, or we erase your entire existence today. It is really that simple." I looked at Preston and his expensive suit. I looked at Chelsea and her deeply disgusted expression. I looked at my own biological children who stood there completely willing to destroy their father for a quick financial payout. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of fear or panic. I simply reached out and patted the inner pocket of my heavy leather jacket, where $80 million in pure, untaxed wealth rested safely against my heart. "You want this dusty old building?" I asked softly, my voice echoing through the damp basement. "Take it. The bricks are completely worthless to me now." I turned around and walked directly toward the two massive medical orderlies. They stepped forward slightly to block my path, expecting me to put up a physical fight. I stopped right in front of them and looked the largest man dead in the eyes. "I am of perfectly sound mind and body," I stated with absolute freezing authority. "If you lay a single finger on me without a signed warrant from a sitting judge, I will personally ensure you spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for kidnapping and severe elder abuse." The two orderlies hesitated. They looked back at Preston for confirmation, but Preston did not have a valid court order yet. He only had loud threats and illegal intimidation. The orderlies slowly stepped aside, creating a narrow path for me. I walked right past them, leaving my arrogant son-in-law and my treacherous children standing in the dark basement of an empty factory. I walked out into the cool Atlanta afternoon, completely free and entirely armed with the greatest financial weapon they could never possibly imagine. The war had officially begun, and they had absolutely no idea they were already completely outgunned. The cool autumn wind hit my face as I walked away from the abandoned textile factory. I left them behind. I walked 3 blocks down the cracked sidewalk until I reached a busy intersection. I pulled out my mobile phone and ordered an upscale ride service. I sat on a wooden bus bench and waited for the black luxury sedan to arrive. My heart was beating steadily in my chest. The heavy leather jacket kept me warm, but the real heat came from the $80 million in corporate bearer bonds resting safely against my ribs. The driver arrived and opened the back door for me. I slid into the comfortable leather seat and gave him the address printed on the heavy watermarked documents my late wife Vivian had hidden. The address belonged to a towering glass and steel skyscraper in the absolute center of the wealthy downtown financial district. I watched the impoverished neighborhoods slowly transition into towering monuments of corporate wealth as we drove closer to the city center. I asked the driver to pull over one block early so I could grab a cup of black coffee from a high-end cafe. I thanked him and walked inside. The smell of roasted espresso beans filled the air. I approached the marble counter and ordered a simple black coffee. The barista smiled politely and told me the total was $5. I reached into my old wallet and pulled out my standard bank debit card. I inserted the plastic chip into the card reader and waited for the familiar approval beep. Instead, the machine flashed a harsh red light and emitted a loud rejection tone. The barista frowned and asked me to try again. I inserted the card a second time. The machine declined it once more. A cold wave of realization washed over me. I checked my mobile phone and saw 3 automated alerts from my local bank and my health insurance provider. My personal checking account was completely frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. My premium health insurance policy was abruptly canceled. I stood in the cafe staring at the small digital screen of my mobile phone. I knew exactly who was responsible for this malicious attack. Preston was a highly connected hedge fund manager with friends in dark corporate places. He knew I needed my daily blood pressure medication to survive. He knew my modest pension was deposited into that specific bank account. He illegally used his powerful financial connections to freeze my assets and cancel my medical lifeline. He wanted to completely cut off my oxygen supply so I would have no choice but to crawl back to the factory and sign over the deed. He wanted to starve me into total submission. He genuinely believed that a 72-year-old black man with no money would panic and completely surrender to his wealthy white son-in-law. I did not feel panic. I felt a deep, calculating rage that sharpened my mind into a lethal weapon. I walked the remaining block to the towering glass skyscraper. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and entered an immaculate lobby paved with imported white marble. Men and women in incredibly expensive tailored suits walked briskly past me. I approached the front security desk. The young guard looked at my worn leather jacket and my scuffed work boots with extreme suspicion. He asked if I was lost. I calmly reached into my inner pocket and placed the top certified document from Vivian's lockbox directly onto his desk. The guard looked at the heavy black ink and the embossed gold seal of the elite law firm located on the top floor of the building. His eyes went wide and he immediately stood up straight. He apologized profusely and personally escorted me to a private express elevator. The glass doors slid shut and I ascended 80 floors into the sky, leaving my old working-class life completely behind me. The elevator opened directly into a massive mahogany reception area. A distinguished older white man wearing a pristine charcoal suit was already standing there waiting for me. He had silver hair and the sharp, calculating eyes of a man who managed the wealth of billionaires. He extended his hand and introduced himself as Mr. Vance, the senior managing partner of the firm. He shook my hand with deep, profound respect. He escorted me down a long hallway lined with expensive modern art and led me into a massive corner office overlooking the entire city of Atlanta. I sat down in a plush leather chair and placed the thick stack of $80 million bearer bonds directly onto his oak desk. I also handed him the encrypted hard drive and the digital voice recorder my wife had left for me. Mr. Vance looked at the documents with a solemn expression. He told me he had been waiting exactly 1 year for me to walk through those doors. Mr. Vance poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and sat across from me. He explained that my late wife Vivian was a brilliant financial mastermind. She did not just own the old abandoned textile factory. She had quietly purchased the entire surrounding industrial block over the last 3 decades, using highly secure anonymous shell companies. She knew the city would eventually expand, and she knew those toxic brick buildings would become incredibly valuable commercial real estate. Mr. Vance then revealed the exact reason my greedy children were trying to force me into a psychiatric ward today. A massive global technology conglomerate named Titanica Corporation was quietly trying to buy the entire industrial block to build a state-of-the-art logistics hub. Titanica Corporation had officially offered $25 million in pure liquid cash for the factory property my children were demanding I sign over to them. The entire puzzle suddenly made perfect sense. Preston and Chelsea did not want the factory because they wanted to renovate it. They wanted it because they secretly knew about the $25 million corporate buyout offer. Preston was facing a massive federal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for embezzling client funds at his hedge fund. He desperately needed a massive infusion of untraceable cash to cover his tracks and avoid spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. They looked at me and saw nothing but a disposable obstacle standing between them and their total financial salvation. They were completely willing to throw a perfectly sane elderly man into a locked memory care unit where I would be heavily medicated until the day I died just to steal $25 million and save Preston's miserable criminal career. I looked at Mr. Vance and took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I told him about the incident at the coffee shop. I explained that Preston had illegally frozen my modest personal bank accounts and canceled my premium health insurance, hoping to trigger a fatal heart attack or force my surrender. Mr. Vance frowned and reached for his desk phone to call his litigation team to fix the insurance issue immediately. I raised my hand and told him to wait. I did not want to just reinstate my health insurance. I wanted to completely eradicate the men and women who tried to destroy my life. I instructed Mr. Vance to officially activate the $80 million offshore trust immediately. I wanted total liquid access to my newly discovered wealth. Mr. Vance typed rapidly on his encrypted computer terminal. Within 60 seconds, the massive fortune Vivian had built was officially transferred into my absolute legal control. I was no longer a retired mechanic. I was one of the wealthiest men in the state. I leaned forward and looked Mr. Vance directly in the eyes. I gave him his very first official directive as my wealth management attorney. I told him to deploy his absolute best forensic accountants and corporate shadow buyers. I did not want to sue Preston for freezing my bank accounts. I wanted to completely own him. I instructed my legal team to begin a hostile shadow takeover of Preston's entire hedge fund debt. Preston was bleeding cash and trying to hide his massive embezzlement from federal regulators. He owed millions to shadow investors and corporate creditors. I told Mr. Vance to use my $80 million war chest to quietly purchase every single piece of debt Preston had ever acquired. I wanted to become his sole absolute creditor without his knowledge. If he owed money on his luxury mansion, I wanted to own the mortgage. If his hedge fund borrowed capital to stay afloat, I wanted to hold the promissory notes. I wanted to weave an invisible web of heavy iron chains completely around his neck. The extremely greedy men who threw me out into the cold were about to discover the terrifying reality of true corporate power. The devastating financial war was now officially and entirely in motion. I sat in the plush leather chair of my new luxury penthouse suite overlooking the beautiful city of Atlanta. The sun was setting and casting long shadows across the towering skyline. My mobile phone buzzed on the cool marble table. It was my wealth management attorney, Mr. Vance. He called to deliver a highly urgent update regarding the massive $25 million real estate buyout. The corporate executives at Titanica Corporation were growing incredibly impatient. They issued a strict 10-day deadline to finalize the purchase of the old textile factory. If the deal did not close within exactly 10 days, they were going to pull their massive cash offer entirely and walk away from the negotiating table forever. This incredibly tight deadline was an absolute nightmare for my greedy son-in-law Preston. Preston desperately needed that $25 million to cover up the massive embezzlement at his hedge fund before the federal investigators audited his corporate books. But he had one major catastrophic problem. He did not legally own the factory, and the actual owner was supposedly missing. My children genuinely believed I was currently shivering on a cold park bench somewhere in the city. Because Preston had illegally frozen my modest personal checking account and canceled my health insurance, they assumed I was completely destitute. They thought I was starving, wandering the dangerous streets without my vital blood pressure medication, completely broken and deeply confused. They honestly believed their cruel psychological warfare had successfully chased me into the dark, dirty gutters of Atlanta. They had absolutely no idea I was sitting in a 5-star penthouse eating imported steak and systematically dismantling their entire financial existence. I opened my encrypted laptop and logged into a highly secure private server. Shortly after my beautiful wife Vivian passed away, I had a professional security team install a network of hidden 4K high-definition cameras inside my old working-class house. I originally installed the discrete cameras to monitor for burglaries while I was working at the hardware store. But tonight, those tiny invisible lenses were actively serving as the ultimate surveillance weapons against my own treacherous blood. I clicked on the live feed from my old living room. The video quality was crystal clear, and the hidden microphones picked up every single whisper perfectly. Preston was pacing aggressively back and forth across my worn living room carpet. He was sweating heavily through his expensive designer shirt. My daughter-in-law Chelsea was sitting on my old sofa, biting her perfectly manicured fingernails with intense, nervous energy. My biological son Terrence and my daughter Camille were standing quietly in the corner looking incredibly stressed. They were completely panicking about the 10-day deadline imposed by Titanica Corporation. They knew that if they did not produce a legally signed deed immediately, the massive corporate buyout would vanish, and Preston's financial crimes would be entirely exposed to the federal government. "We cannot wait any longer," Preston shouted, his voice echoing loudly through my empty house. "The corporate developers gave us exactly 10 days. If we do not hand them a clean title by next Friday, the entire deal is completely dead, and I am going to federal prison. We need the old man to sign the transfer of deed right now." Chelsea stood up and smoothed out her expensive silk blouse. "We cannot find him, Preston," she complained with a highly irritated tone. "The police have not seen him. The hospitals do not have him. The old fool probably forgot his own name and wandered off into the woods. We do not have time to hunt down a senile old black man who refuses to cooperate with our business plans. We have to take matters into our own hands today." Before Terrence could even ask what she meant, a heavy knock sounded at my front door. Preston quickly walked over and opened it. A short, balding white man carrying a worn leather briefcase stepped into my living room. He did not look like a respectable legal professional. He had the shifty, nervous energy of a career criminal. Preston greeted the man and introduced him to the rest of the room as Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins was a corrupt underground notary public who made a very lucrative living by legally stamping fraudulent documents for desperate corporate criminals. He was a man who happily sold his official state seal to the absolute highest bidder. Preston reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. He handed the heavy stack of cash directly to Mr. Higgins. My hidden microphones captured the entire illegal transaction with flawless audio precision. Higgins greedily counted the money and smiled. He opened his worn briefcase and pulled out his heavy official notary stamp. He placed it carefully on my old wooden coffee table. Chelsea walked over to the coffee table and proudly pulled a crisp white legal document out of her designer purse. It was a fraudulent transfer of deed, completely surrendering the total ownership of the old textile factory directly to Preston and Chelsea. The only thing missing was my official signature at the very bottom of the page. Chelsea also pulled out an old tax return she had stolen from my desk drawer. It contained my genuine signature. She placed it next to the fraudulent deed and pulled out a heavy black ink pen. Terrence suddenly stepped forward, his face pale with sudden nervous hesitation. "Are we really going to do this?" Terrence asked, his voice shaking slightly. "If we forge his signature on a major commercial property deed, we are crossing a massive legal line. This is a severe felony. What if the old man shows up and tells the police he never signed it?" Preston aggressively grabbed Terrence by the collar of his shirt and shoved him backward. "Shut your mouth, you pathetic coward," Preston hissed maliciously. "The old man is completely senile and starving on the street. Even if he does show up, nobody is going to believe a confused poor old mechanic over a highly successful wealth manager and a licensed real estate agent. We hold all the power in this city. You are going to stand there and keep your mouth shut while we secure your financial future." Terrence immediately folded, completely submitting to Preston's arrogant authority. He backed away and looked at the floor in absolute shame. Chelsea smiled wickedly and sat down at the coffee table. She spent 5 minutes carefully practicing my signature on a scrap piece of paper. She studied the loops and the angles of my handwriting with intense criminal focus. When she felt completely confident, she moved the heavy black pen over to the fraudulent transfer of deed. I sat perfectly still in my penthouse, watching my daughter-in-law actively steal my property on a live high-definition video feed. She pressed the pen to the paper and smoothly forged my exact signature on the bottom line. She smiled brightly and pushed the document across the table to Mr. Higgins. The corrupt notary did not ask a single question. He picked up his official heavy metal state seal and pressed it down firmly over the forged signature. A loud, sharp clack echoed through the living room as the fraudulent deed became a certified, notarized government document. They actually cheered. Preston clapped his hands together and kissed Chelsea passionately on the cheek. Camille let out a massive sigh of relief and hugged Terence. They opened a bottle of cheap wine they found in my kitchen and poured glasses to celebrate their massive criminal victory. They genuinely believed they had just successfully stolen $25 million. They thought they had completely outsmarted the system and secured their wealthy lifestyles forever. They toasted to their own brilliant deception, totally unaware that they were celebrating their own funeral. My mobile phone buzzed again. Mr. Vance was calling on the encrypted line. He was also monitoring the live camera feed from his corporate law office. "Roland," he said, his voice tight with professional urgency, "they have officially forged the document. We have crystal clear video evidence of the entire criminal act. If they walk out of that house and file that deed with the county clerk, it becomes an incredibly messy legal situation. Give me the green light, and I will have my security team intercept them right now before they can leave the driveway." I looked at the screen. Preston was carefully folding the forged deed and sliding it into his expensive leather jacket. They were getting ready to drive downtown to the county records office. I took a slow, deep breath of the quiet air in my penthouse. "Do not intercept them." "Arthur," I commanded, keeping my voice incredibly smooth and completely devoid of emotion. "Let them walk out the front door. Let them get into their luxury cars and drive all the way downtown." Arthur paused, clearly confused by my sudden instruction. "Roland, if they file that paperwork, the property transfer goes into the official state system. We will have to spend weeks untangling the fraud in a civil court. Why would we let them officially record a forged document? Because signing a fake document in a private living room is a simple state-level crime," I explained, watching Preston and Chelsea walk out my front door on the video feed. "But the second they physically hand that fraudulent deed to a government clerk and the clerk uploads it into the digital county registry, it crosses a massive legal threshold. The electronic transfer of that fraudulent property data across state servers instantly triggers severe federal wire fraud statutes. The illegal acquisition of a commercial property valued over $20 million triggers massive federal real estate fraud. And using my name to do it is aggravated federal identity theft." I took a slow sip of my coffee and let a cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. "I do not want to sue them in a local civil court," Arthur, I continued. "I want to completely bury them under the absolute crushing weight of the federal government. I want the Federal Bureau of Investigation to handle their prosecution. Let them file the paperwork. Let them unknowingly lock themselves inside a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. Arthur let out a low, sharp laugh over the phone line. He completely understood the brilliant, catastrophic depth of my strategy. "You are a profoundly dangerous man," Roland, Arthur said with deep professional respect. "I will immediately begin preparing the evidence packages for the federal authorities. We will let them file the deed today." I hung up the phone and closed my encrypted laptop. My children thought they were incredibly smart. They thought their arrogant white privilege and their fake corporate status made them completely untouchable. They genuinely believed they could step on a retired black mechanic and walk away with his millions. But they had absolutely no idea that I was quietly building a flawless, inescapable legal cage entirely around them. They were happily marching downtown right now to personally hand the federal government all the evidence needed to completely destroy their lives. I leaned back in my plush leather chair and looked out over the beautiful Atlanta skyline. The trap was perfectly set, and my arrogant children were eagerly sprinting directly into the heavy steel jaws. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds over Atlanta, but the digital world was already infected with a new kind of toxic darkness. I was sitting at the mahogany dining table in my luxury penthouse suite, enjoying a hot cup of dark roast coffee. My encrypted mobile phone vibrated silently on the marble counter. It was my wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance. He did not call to discuss the federal wire fraud and real estate forgery charges we were preparing against my children. He called to inform me that my daughter-in-law Chelsea had just launched a massive psychological offensive on the internet. Criminals always know deep down when they have crossed a point of absolute no return. Chelsea knew filing a forged commercial real estate deed was a massive legal risk that carried decades in federal prison. She desperately needed a public narrative to justify her sudden illegal acquisition of a $25 million industrial property. She needed the entire world to believe that she was a reluctant noble hero stepping in to save a broken family from a total disaster. So she decided to weaponize the most historically dangerous and destructive tool she possessed in her social arsenal. She weaponized her fake white woman tears for an audience of millions. Arthur sent me a direct link to a viral video posted on a social media application. I opened the secure application on my tablet and watched the screen. Chelsea was sitting on the floor of her luxurious suburban living room. She wore an oversized beige cardigan sweater intentionally chosen to make her look small, fragile, and completely overwhelmed by the burdens of life. Her expensive blonde hair was tied up in a messy, tangled bun. She had scrubbed the makeup from her face, leaving her skin looking pale and exhausted. She looked directly into the camera lens with fearful eyes and took a deep, shaky breath. The performance was absolutely sickening to watch. It was a masterclass in extreme sociopathic manipulation. She began the video by introducing herself as a terrified mother and devoted wife who was completely breaking under the massive weight of a horrifying family tragedy. She told her millions of new viewers that her elderly black father-in-law had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. She claimed my mind had completely deteriorated into severe late-stage dementia over the past weeks. She looked into the lens and forced a single large tear to roll down her cheek. She said that I had become incredibly violent and physically abusive toward her and my own biological children. She told the world that I was wandering the dangerous streets of Atlanta completely out of my mind, threatening innocent people and refusing all medical help. She claimed I was a severe danger to society and a massive threat to my own innocent grandchildren. But the true malicious brilliance of her video came in the second half. Chelsea planted the specific psychological seed to legally justify the massive real estate fraud she had just committed downtown. She cried loudly into the microphone, claiming that my severe mental decline had put our entire family in extreme financial danger. She said out of pure desperate love, she and Preston had no choice but to step in and legally take over my business affairs to save me from destroying the family legacy. She painted the forged transfer of the factory deed not as a massive federal crime, but as a noble, desperate act trying to protect a sick, violent old man from his tragic insanity. She begged the public for their prayers, their financial donations, and their deep understanding during this incredibly dark time. The digital response to her fake performance was immediate and completely overwhelming. The video accumulated over 5 million views in less than 12 hours. The internet is a massive, mindless machine that feeds exclusively on unverified emotion. Millions of strangers who knew absolutely nothing about my life or my decades of hard work immediately sided with the fragile, crying white woman on their screens. The comment section was a toxic wasteland of misplaced sympathy and extreme racial hostility. People called me a dangerous, violent thug who was incredibly lucky to have such a caring and patient daughter-in-law. They praised Chelsea as an absolute saint and a hero for stepping up to handle a volatile elderly man. My biological children saw the wave of public support and immediately rushed to join the disgusting digital circus. Terrence posted a long, highly emotional comment under the viral video. He claimed that his heart was completely shattered by his father's rapid mental decline. He publicly thanked Chelsea and Preston for taking the heavy burden of my complex financial affairs onto their shoulders so he could focus entirely on grieving. My daughter Camille uploaded her own video response an hour later. She sat in her expensive luxury car wearing large dark sunglasses to hide her supposedly swollen eyes. She wept softly and told her followers that she lived in constant physical terror of my unpredictable, violent outbursts. She completely validated Chelsea's false narrative, confirming to the entire world that I was a dangerous liability who desperately needed to be stripped of all my assets for the greater good of the family. My legal team was absolutely furious. Within an hour, Arthur Vance arrived at my penthouse suite with 3 senior litigation attorneys. They marched into my living room carrying thick stacks of printed social media transcripts and digital engagement metrics. Arthur was vibrating with intense professional anger. He threw the heavy papers onto the glass dining table and demanded immediate, aggressive legal action. "Roland, we cannot allow this completely fabricated narrative to spread another single inch," Arthur stated, his voice tight with extreme frustration. They are actively assassinating your character on a global scale to build a public defense for their federal real estate fraud. Chelsea is laying the psychological groundwork to convince a jury that she forged that property deed out of medical necessity. They are trying to poison the entire potential jury pool. We have the hidden camera footage of them laughing while actively forging your signature. We have the official medical evaluations proving your mind is exceptionally sharp. I have a team of 10 lawyers ready to file a $50 million defamation lawsuit right this second. We can secure an emergency judicial cease and desist order and force every social media platform to scrub those fraudulent videos from the internet before noon today. I stood quietly by the large glass window looking down at the busy downtown traffic. The aggressive corporate attorneys in the room waited eagerly for my command to unleash their absolute legal fury. I felt the cool air conditioning of the penthouse brushing against my face. I turned around and looked at Arthur. I slowly raised my right hand, signaling for absolute silence in the room. "Do not file a single lawsuit today," I commanded, my voice incredibly calm and completely steady. "Do not contact any federal judges and do not send any cease and desist letters to anyone. We are going to do absolutely nothing to stop them." Arthur stared at me in total disbelief. "Roland, they are completely destroying your reputation," he argued. "They are manipulating millions of innocent people to view you as a violent, insane criminal. They are actively collecting thousands of dollars in public donations based entirely on a highly malicious lie. You cannot just sit here and let them control the entire public narrative." I walked over to the table and looked at the printed image of Chelsea's crying face. I felt absolutely no anger toward her. I only felt the calculated patience of a man holding an unbeatable hand of cards. "You are thinking like a traditional lawyer, Arthur," I explained softly. "You want to stop the immediate public damage. I am thinking like a man who wants to completely and permanently eradicate a toxic infection from his life. If we stop them right now, they will claim we used our massive hidden wealth to aggressively silence them. They will become permanent martyrs on the internet. I absolutely refuse to give them that easy escape route." I tapped my index finger firmly against the printed photograph on the table. "They are currently building a massive towering monument entirely out of lies," I told the room. "They are stacking every brick with their own 2 hands, fueled completely by the validation of strangers. They feel incredibly powerful and completely untouchable right now. Let them climb, Arthur. Let them build their tower of lies high. Let the entire world look up at them in absolute admiration. Let them secure television appearances. When you fall from a small stepping stool, you only bruise your knee. But when you fall from a towering skyscraper, the drop is fatal. Let them climb to the absolute top of their glory. The fall from the top will break all their bones." The internet continued to burn with the massive digital wildfire of Chelsea's fake tears, but I completely ignored the noise. Social media likes and viral videos do not hold any actual weight in the ruthless world of corporate finance. While my daughter-in-law was busy playing the ultimate victim for millions of gullible strangers on her mobile phone, her husband Preston was facing a catastrophic reality check. The heavy gears of my trap were finally beginning to crush his arrogant spirit. My wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, had perfectly orchestrated the next phase of our financial warfare. Titanica Corporation was still officially offering $25 million for the old textile factory property. Preston and Chelsea had successfully filed the forged transfer of deed with the county clerk. They genuinely believed they were only a few short days away from a massive payday. They thought the federal wire fraud and real estate forgery they committed were completely untraceable. But commercial real estate transactions involving multinational conglomerates are never that simple. Titanica Corporation conducted a mandatory deep title search on the factory property as part of their standard corporate due diligence. Arthur Vance had anticipated this exact standard procedure. Decades ago, my brilliant late wife Vivian had intentionally placed a highly complex environmental toxic waste lien on the factory land to prevent city developers from trying to seize the property through eminent domain. The legal lien clearly stated that the soil required extensive environmental remediation before any commercial sale could officially close. The total cost to clear that specific toxic waste lien and secure a clean title was exactly $1,500,000 in pure liquid cash. When the corporate lawyers at Titanica Corporation informed Preston about the massive environmental lien, his entire fake reality completely shattered. He was sitting in my old living room staring at the official legal email on his laptop screen. My hidden high-definition cameras captured the exact moment his arrogant white privilege evaporated into pure, unadulterated panic. He desperately needed that $25 million buyout to cover up his massive hedge fund embezzlement before the federal authorities raided his office. He needed the factory sale to close immediately. But Titanica Corporation made it absolutely clear they would not wire a single penny until the $1.5 million lien was paid in full. Preston was a highly successful hedge fund manager on paper, but in reality, he was completely broke. He had secretly drained his own personal accounts to temporarily hide his corporate crimes. He lived a lavish lifestyle funded entirely by massive credit card debt and stolen client money. He did not have $1,500,000. He did not even have $10,000 in clean, usable cash. He looked over at my biological son Terrence, who was sitting on the old sofa playing a game on his mobile phone. Terrence was completely useless. Terrence was 46 years old and survived entirely on the money he used to quietly steal from my small business accounts. Neither of them had the cash to clear the environmental lien. They were staring directly at a $25 million finish line, but they were physically trapped behind a massive financial wall they could not possibly climb. Preston could not go to a traditional bank for a commercial bridge loan. Traditional banks require extensive background checks and deep financial audits. A thorough audit would instantly expose his massive hedge fund embezzlement and send him directly to a federal penitentiary. He needed a shadow lender. He needed an unregulated private equity firm that specialized in high-risk offshore predatory lending. He needed a company that would hand him $1.5 million in cash immediately without asking any legal questions. This was the exact moment Arthur Vance executed our brilliant masterstroke. I instructed Arthur to establish a highly secretive, anonymous offshore private equity firm completely funded by my $80 million trust. We named the shell company Apex Horizon Financial Solutions. On paper, it looked like a ruthless, highly aggressive lending syndicate based in the Cayman Islands. In reality, every single dollar in that firm belonged directly to me. Arthur used a network of highly discreet corporate fixers to directly contact Preston. The fixer presented himself as a savior for high-net-worth individuals facing temporary severe liquidity crises. He smoothly told Preston that Apex Horizon Financial Solutions was willing to fast-track a massive no-questions-asked cash loan to solve all of his immediate problems. He offered Preston the exact $1,500,000 required to clear the toxic waste lien and save the $25 million Titanica Corporation deal. It was exactly the magical financial lifeline Preston was desperately begging the universe to provide. Preston did not ask any critical questions about the anonymous offshore company. He did not hire an independent lawyer to carefully read the dense, highly restrictive fine print of the loan agreement. Desperate, terrified criminals do not care about long-term financial consequences when federal investigators are knocking on their corporate doors. He eagerly accepted the predatory terms. But Apex Horizon Financial Solutions was not a charity. The interest rates on the bridge loan were astronomically high. The default penalties were immediate, severe, and entirely unforgiving. The most important part of the trap was the required collateral. In order to receive the massive emergency cash payout, Preston and Terrence had to personally guarantee the loan. They had to officially sign away the total remaining equity of their expensive luxury homes and officially transfer the legal titles of their high-end luxury vehicles directly to the offshore firm. If they missed even a single precisely timed payment, or if the Titanica Corporation deal failed to close, my shell company would have the absolute legal right to immediately seize all of their properties and violently evict them onto the street without a lengthy court battle. They were required to put every single remaining asset they owned directly on the chopping block. Preston convinced Terrence to sign the documents by promising him a massive cut of the $25 million factory sale. Terrence was completely blinded by his own toxic greed. He foolishly agreed to risk his expensive suburban home because he genuinely believed the factory sale was a guaranteed absolute certainty. He thought he was finally going to become a self-made millionaire. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Preston and Terrence rushed into the sleek modern downtown offices of the legal firm representing Apex Horizon Financial Solutions. They were warmly greeted by professional, smiling corporate executives who handed them freshly printed contracts and heavy, expensive pens. I sat comfortably in my luxury penthouse suite watching the live high-definition security feed from the conference room. I watched my arrogant son-in-law and my treacherous biological son eagerly sign their names on the dotted lines without reading a single paragraph. I watched Preston's hands shaking with absolute pure relief as he signed away the legal rights to his massive luxury mansion. I watched Terrence eagerly initial the pages that handed over the ownership rights to his expensive cars. They smiled at each other. They actually shook hands, completely convinced that they had successfully outsmarted the universe once again. They thought they had found a magical financial loophole to escape the brutal consequences of their horrible actions. They thought this nameless, faceless corporate entity was their absolute saving grace. They had absolutely no idea that every single signature was another heavy iron nail being hammered directly into their own coffins. They had no idea that the money being wired into their bank accounts to clear the toxic waste lien was my money. The trap was officially sprung. The steel jaws slammed shut entirely around their ankles, and they were so incredibly foolish that they did not even feel the intense physical pain yet. I sat back in my comfortable leather chair, staring at the frozen image of their smiling, ignorant faces on my secure tablet screen. They were now fully bound to me by heavy chains made of solid, unbreakable legal iron. I legally owned their massive toxic debts. I owned the mortgages to their beautiful homes. I owned the titles to their luxury cars. I owned their entire pathetic futures. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my dark roast coffee. The intense financial bleeding had been temporarily stopped, but only because I was patiently preparing to personally harvest every single drop of blood they had left in their veins. They thought they were brilliant corporate players manipulating a broken system for their own massive financial gain. They did not realize they were dancing on a stage that I entirely owned inside a theater that I completely controlled. I was no longer just the elderly retired black mechanic they looked down upon. I was legally their sole creditor, and I held the ultimate power of life and death. I had spent my entire adult life counting pennies to ensure my family never went hungry. I always shopped at the discount supermarkets on the south side of Atlanta, carefully comparing the prices of canned goods and frozen vegetables. But my reality had completely shifted. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, I decided to visit an incredibly exclusive high-end grocery market located in the wealthy Buckhead district. I wanted to purchase premium cuts of meat and fresh organic produce to cook a proper meal in my luxury penthouse suite. I wore a tailored wool coat over a crisp button-down shirt. I did not look like the starving, senile old man my daughter-in-law Chelsea was crying about on the internet. I looked exactly like a man who comfortably controlled an $80 million financial empire. I pushed my sleek metal shopping cart down the pristine, brightly lit aisles, enjoying the quiet, refined atmosphere of the elite store. I was standing near the imported cheese display when I heard a highly familiar and deeply irritating voice. I turned my head slightly and looked down the adjacent aisle. My biological son Terrence and my arrogant son-in-law Preston were standing near the expensive wine section. They looked incredibly stressed and deeply exhausted. They were likely arguing about the massive predatory loan they had just signed with my anonymous offshore company. They had absolutely no idea they were already completely trapped. Preston was aggressively gesturing with his hands while Terrence stared blankly at the floor. And then Terrence looked up. His eyes locked directly onto mine. All the color instantly drained from his face. He nudged Preston sharply in the ribs and pointed a trembling finger in my direction. Preston spun around and his jaw dropped in absolute shock. They fully expected me to be freezing in a dirty alleyway wearing rags and begging for loose change. Instead, they saw me standing in one of the most expensive grocery stores in the state, looking incredibly healthy and entirely unbothered by their existence. I did not react to their panicked stares. I simply turned back to the display, selected a wedge of aged cheese, and placed it into my cart. I calmly walked to the front checkout counter and paid for my expensive groceries using a premium black corporate card linked directly to my new offshore trust. I walked out of the sliding glass doors into the massive concrete parking garage. The underground parking structure was dimly lit and completely empty in my specific section. My private security detail instructed me to always park in highly secure, isolated areas to maintain a clear, tactical perimeter. I walked slowly toward my waiting luxury vehicle, listening to the loud, aggressive sound of heavy footsteps rapidly approaching from behind. Preston and Terrence were sprinting out of the grocery store, desperately trying to catch me before I could leave the premises. They thought they had just caught a massive lucky break. They thought they finally had the opportunity to physically intimidate me into total silence. "Desmond, wait!" Preston shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the cold concrete walls of the parking garage. I stopped walking and slowly turned around to face them. I stood perfectly still, holding my paper grocery bag. Preston marched directly up to me, completely invading my personal space. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The fake, sophisticated corporate persona he usually projected to his wealthy hedge fund clients completely vanished into thin air. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with toxic adrenaline. Terrence flanked him on the right, trying to look intimidating but failing miserably. "You think you are incredibly smart, old man," Preston hissed, stepping so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "We know exactly what you are doing. You are hiding out in the wealthy suburbs, trying to pretend you are a massive player. You are trying to scare us into backing out of the corporate deal." I looked at Preston with absolute freezing indifference. I did not speak a single word. My silence completely infuriated him. He wanted me to argue. He wanted me to cower in fear. When I refused to play his pathetic game, his deeply ingrained white supremacy violently boiled to the surface. "You listen to me very closely, you lucky old thug." Preston spat, his voice dripping with intense malicious racism. "You do not deserve that prime industrial real estate. You do not have the education or the pedigree to manage $25 million. You are nothing but a retired mechanic who stumbled blindly onto a gold mine. People like you are completely ruining this city. We already filed the transfer of deed with the county clerk. The property officially belongs to us now. The corporate buyout is closing on Friday, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. If you even think about walking into a police station to report that deed as a forgery, I swear to God I will personally beat you within an inch of your miserable life." Terrence stepped forward, entirely complicit in the violent threat against his own biological father. "You need to listen to him, Dad," Terrence said, his voice trembling with fake tough guy energy. "We hold all the cards now. Chelsea already told the entire internet that you are completely insane and highly violent. The public completely believes her. If you go to the authorities, they will just think it is another crazy delusion from a sick old black man. We will have you thrown into a padded cell before the sun goes down. Just walk away and accept your total defeat." Preston smiled a sick, twisted smile, entirely convinced that they had successfully cornered me. He raised his right hand and aggressively shoved my shoulder, pushing me backward against the cold metal hood of a parked luxury car. "You are going to keep your mouth shut," Preston threatened, raising his fist into the air, preparing to strike an elderly man in a dark parking garage. He never even saw the shadows move. The response was incredibly violent, absolutely silent, and flawlessly executed. My invisible private security detail consisted of former elite special forces operators who specialized in immediate high-threat neutralization. They had been actively tracking my exact position from the moment I stepped out of the grocery store. It took exactly 5 seconds to completely end the confrontation. A massive figure dressed entirely in tactical dark clothing materialized from behind a concrete pillar. The security operator grabbed Preston's raised arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and swept his legs completely out from under him. With a single, fluid, incredibly brutal motion, the operator slammed Preston face first directly into the hard steel hood of the parked car. The sickening sound of Preston's nose cracking against the metal echoed loudly through the empty garage. Before Terrence could even process the violent blur of motion, a second tactical operator appeared from the darkness and drove his heavy knee directly into Terrence's stomach. Terrence collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, completely paralyzed by blinding physical pain and absolute terror. Preston let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream as the first operator pressed a heavy tactical boot firmly against the back of his neck, completely immobilizing him against the vehicle. The dark parking garage was instantly transformed into a heavily secured military perimeter. 2 more armed operators stepped out of the shadows, officially securing all the exit routes. I stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos. I calmly adjusted the lapels of my tailored wool coat and looked down at the 2 pathetic men pinned helplessly against the hard surfaces. Preston was bleeding heavily from his shattered nose, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated panic as he stared at the tactical boots holding him down. Terrence was whimpering like a beaten dog, gasping desperately for air on the dirty floor. They had completely forgotten that true power does not scream in a parking garage. True power speaks softly and carries a highly lethal shadow. I slowly walked over to Preston. The heavy, deliberate thud of my expensive leather shoes echoed in the quiet garage. I stopped right next to his bleeding face. I looked down at him with a cold, ruthless smile slowly spreading across my face. He tried to speak to beg for mercy, but the massive security operator applied just enough pressure to keep his jaw pinned firmly against the steel hood. "Thank you," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm, completely ignoring their pathetic whimpering. I needed concrete, irrefutable evidence of a violent physical felony to permanently seal your absolute destruction with the federal authorities. Thank you for providing the high-definition security footage for an attempted assault and extreme elder abuse. I stepped gracefully around their pinned, trembling bodies. I climbed into the warm, comfortable leather seat, leaving them completely paralyzed on the cold concrete. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my luxury penthouse, reading through a thick stack of heavily encrypted financial documents. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, illuminating the devastating truth printed on the crisp white paper. My wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, had successfully deployed his elite team of forensic accountants to completely dismantle the professional life of my arrogant son-in-law, Preston. Preston always projected the fake image of a highly successful and brilliant hedge fund manager. He wore custom-tailored Italian suits, drove imported sports cars, and constantly looked down on my working-class background with absolute freezing contempt. But the extensive forensic audit revealed that his entire corporate empire was a massive, decaying house of cards built entirely on stolen money and desperate criminal lies. The heavily stamped documents detailed exactly how Preston had been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from his wealthy clients for the past 4 years. He was secretly funneling the stolen capital into high-risk offshore accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle and to desperately cover his massive trading losses. But his incredibly toxic luck had finally run out completely. The official audit clearly showed that the Securities and Exchange Commission had officially opened a massive federal investigation into his fraudulent firm. The federal regulators were actively closing in on his massive financial crimes. They were currently preparing to freeze all of his corporate accounts and issue severe federal indictments that carried decades in federal prison. Preston was entirely backed into a dark, dangerous corner with absolutely nowhere left to hide. That was exactly why he desperately needed the $25 million factory sale to close without any delays. He desperately needed that massive infusion of clean, untraceable cash to quietly replace the stolen funds before the federal agents kicked down his polished office doors. He was nothing but a cornered, terrified rat, entirely willing to completely destroy his elderly black father-in-law just to save his own miserable skin. I slowly closed the heavy financial folder and opened my encrypted laptop. I clicked on the live feed from the hidden 4K high-definition security cameras I had carefully installed inside my old living room. The visual contrast between Preston's terrifying legal reality and his current arrogant behavior was absolutely staggering to witness. Preston was standing right in the center of my old house, holding a delicate crystal glass filled with incredibly expensive champagne. He had a thick white medical bandage taped securely across the bridge of his broken nose, where my private security operator had violently slammed his face into the car hood in the grocery store parking lot. Despite the humiliating physical beating he had just endured, he was currently celebrating like a victorious ancient king. My daughter-in-law, Chelsea, was sitting on my old fabric sofa, smiling brightly and raising her glass in a triumphant, highly arrogant toast. My biological children, Terrence and Camille, were cheering loudly, completely blinded by their own toxic consuming greed. They were celebrating because they had just received an official corporate email from the executive board of Titanica Corporation. The massive global technology conglomerate had officially approved their forged transfer of deed and successfully processed the toxic waste lien clearance funded directly by my anonymous offshore loan. They had officially scheduled the final $25 million closing meeting for this upcoming Friday morning. The ultimate financial finish line was resting directly in their eager sights. Preston loudly bragged to the entire room that they had successfully beaten the system and conquered the world. He laughed and confidently told Terrence that my violent physical retaliation in the dark parking garage was actually a massive sign of total pathetic weakness. He claimed I was physically lashing out simply because I finally knew I was completely powerless to stop the massive corporate buyout. Chelsea smiled her incredibly wicked smile and proudly stated that her viral crying social media videos had completely paralyzed me, preventing me from ever going to the police. They genuinely believed they had officially won the entire war. They thought they were brilliant, untouchable criminal masterminds who had successfully stolen a massive generational fortune and permanently secured their highly luxurious futures forever. They were loudly popping champagne corks and toasting to their fraudulent millions, completely unaware that I was actively plotting a massive corporate execution that would entirely vaporize their entire existence. I closed the laptop screen and picked up my highly secure encrypted mobile phone. I immediately called Arthur Vance and firmly instructed him to come up to my penthouse suite without any delay. When Arthur arrived, he was carrying a sleek silver briefcase containing the final heavy legal injunctions required to permanently block the Friday closing meeting. He completely assumed I was finally ready to present the forged property deed to the federal authorities and have my treacherous children arrested for massive real estate fraud before the Titanica deal could be finalized. Arthur confidently sat across from me at the glass dining table and opened his silver briefcase, completely ready to unleash a massive, highly destructive legal firestorm upon my family. I looked directly at my brilliant wealth management attorney and slowly shook my head. "Do not file those legal injunctions." "Arthur," I commanded, my voice perfectly smooth and completely calm. "I do not want to stop the $25 million commercial real estate sale. I want the Friday closing meeting to proceed exactly as they currently have it scheduled." Arthur instantly frowned in deep, profound professional confusion. "Desmond, if we let them walk into that corporate boardroom and sign the final closing documents, they will officially receive the $25 million, he argued passionately. They will immediately use that massive cash payout to completely pay off Preston's massive hedge fund embezzlement, and they might actually manage to escape the federal investigation entirely. Why would we possibly allow Titanica Corporation to successfully buy a stolen commercial property using a highly fraudulent deed?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, enjoying the rich, bitter taste. "Because I do not just want to stop the corporate buyer." "Arthur," I explained, letting a cold, ruthless smile slowly spread across my face. "I want to completely and absolutely own the corporate buyer. Titanica Corporation is a massive global technology conglomerate, but they actively operate through highly decentralized regional corporate divisions. I want you to take my $80 million offshore war chest and quietly initiate a massive hostile corporate buyout of Titanica Corporation's entire regional real estate division here in the Southeast." Arthur Vance stared directly at me in absolute stunned, breathless silence. The sheer catastrophic, brilliant depth of the financial strategy slowly dawned on his highly analytical mind. He realized I was not just playing simple legal defense to protect my old factory. I was completely rewriting the entire fundamental rules of the modern corporate battlefield. I wanted to legally purchase the exact specific corporate entity that was officially scheduled to buy my stolen industrial property. I wanted to quietly become the absolute supreme executive boss of the very corporate directors who were actively organizing the Friday closing meeting. Arthur did not ask any more questions. He immediately closed his sleek silver briefcase and opened his highly encrypted professional laptop. He rapidly utilized his elite network of billionaire private investors and highly aggressive corporate brokers to immediately execute the massive shadow acquisition. The regional real estate division of Titanica Corporation was already undergoing severe financial restructuring, and they eagerly accepted a massive premium liquid cash offer directly from my anonymous offshore trust. In less than 48 hours, the highly complex corporate paperwork was heavily stamped, legally certified, and entirely finalized by the Federal Trade Commissions. I officially became the primary majority shareholder and the absolute supreme executive director of the Titanica Regional Real Estate Division. I now wielded the ultimate absolute corporate authority over the specific company my greedy children desperately needed to save their miserable lives. I stood quietly by the floor-to-ceiling glass window of my luxury penthouse, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful city of Atlanta. My arrogant biological children and my highly toxic in-laws were currently sitting in my old working-class house, drinking expensive imported champagne and excitedly dreaming of their massive $25 million payday. They genuinely thought they were successfully selling my stolen property to a massive, faceless, untouchable global megacorporation. They had absolutely no idea that the massive, terrifying corporate entity they were happily dealing with was actually their own 72-year-old black father. I had completely trapped them inside an inescapable, invisible financial cage. I officially owned their massive predatory loans and their luxury homes through my shadow lending firm. I held the crystal-clear, high-definition video evidence of their massive federal wire fraud and severe elder abuse. The ultimate deadly corporate trap was flawlessly set, and my arrogant enemies were finished. The digital world is a loud and chaotic place, but it is entirely meaningless when compared to the silent, absolute weight of true financial power. My daughter-in-law Chelsea had spent the entire week crying fake tears on the internet to build a false narrative. My biological children had publicly supported her lies, completely convinced they were controlling the battlefield. They thought public opinion was their greatest weapon. But I knew that true power does not operate on social media platforms. True power dictates the fundamental reality of the physical world. I sat in my luxury penthouse suite overlooking the beautiful skyline of Atlanta. I finished my morning coffee and called my wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance. It was officially time to completely shift the tectonic plates of the city. I instructed Arthur to bypass the internet entirely and go straight to the most elite, respected financial and philanthropic institutions in the state of Georgia. I told him to draft a massive, legally binding press statement and release it to every major news network and financial publication. We were officially announcing the launch of the Vivian Sterling Foundation. I named the foundation after my beautiful late wife because she was the brilliant, silent architect of our massive offshore empire. She was a woman who believed deeply in the power of hard work and community uplift. The press release boldly announced that the Vivian Sterling Foundation was being established with a staggering initial endowment of exactly $50 million in pure liquid cash. But the foundation had a very specific and highly targeted mission. It was entirely dedicated to funding and supporting young, brilliant, black-owned technology startups across the city of Atlanta. I deliberately structured this massive charitable entity to empower the exact demographic of people my arrogant white son-in-law Preston constantly looked down upon. Preston and my biological son Terrence had spent their entire lives failing at fake technology applications and corrupt hedge funds. They believed they were inherently superior corporate masterminds. I wanted to build a towering $50 million monument to black excellence using the very money my greedy family had tried to steal from me in the dark. Arthur Vance distributed the press release to the major news networks. The impact was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly explosive. News stations immediately interrupted their broadcasts to announce that a retired black mechanic was injecting $50 million into the local economy. The public narrative that Chelsea had carefully built on the internet instantly fractured into a million pieces. People could not logically reconcile the image of a violent, senile old man with the undeniable reality of a highly sophisticated philanthropic titan. While the media networks were busy praising my name as a visionary community leader, my biological children and my toxic in-laws were sitting in my old house completely unaware of the impending earthquake. I opened my encrypted laptop and clicked on the live feed from my hidden high-definition security cameras. They were sitting around the old television set drinking cheap wine and celebrating their upcoming $25 million corporate buyout. But their pathetic celebration came to a sudden, violent end when the local news anchor appeared on the screen holding a copy of my official press release. I watched closely as the color completely drained from Terrence's face. He dropped his wine glass onto the carpet. It shattered loudly, but nobody in the room even blinked. Preston's jaw dropped wide open in absolute breathless horror. Chelsea stood up from the sofa, her eyes wide and completely terrified, as the news anchor read the details of the $50 million endowment. The absolute shock paralyzing their bodies was incredibly satisfying to witness. They finally realized the terrifying magnitude of the massive mistake they had made. They realized they had not just evicted a poor, helpless old man. They had actively declared war on a multimillionaire who possessed the financial power to completely eradicate their entire existence. The heavy, suffocating silence in my old living room lasted for exactly 5 minutes. Preston was doing the frantic mathematical calculations in his head. He knew the factory they forged the deed for was worth $25 million. Hearing that I was locking $50 million into a permanent charitable trust meant his massive generational wealth was rapidly disappearing. Chelsea began to panic, pacing back and forth across the room. She complained loudly that I was giving away her rightful inheritance to complete strangers. Her intense selfishness completely blinded her to the reality of her horrific criminal actions. But hungry, desperate rats will always look for a new way into the kitchen. Chelsea suddenly stopped pacing and turned to the rest of the family. She formulated a brilliantly stupid plan built entirely on breathtaking arrogance and total delusion. She pointed out that I was only putting $50 million into the foundation. She confidently guessed that there had to be millions more hidden in my private offshore accounts. She convinced Preston, Terrence, and Camille that this highly publicized charity gala was actually their absolute last chance at financial salvation. Chelsea spun a wildly delusional narrative for the room. She told them that wealthy philanthropists cared about nothing more than their pristine public image. She aggressively argued that a man hosting a massive charity event honoring his late wife would absolutely hate the optics of a messy, unresolved family feud bleeding into the spotlight. She completely convinced my treacherous children that if they showed up at the glamorous launch gala dressed perfectly and staged a massive, emotional public apology in front of all the cameras, I would have absolutely no choice but to forgive them. She confidently stated that I would be too embarrassed to reject my own crying children in front of the mayor and the elite business class. She told them they could use the intense public pressure to force me into a fake public reconciliation, effectively getting their names written back into my massive will. It was a pathetic plan, but they were completely desperate. They genuinely thought they were arriving at the last minute to save the day and reclaim their fortune. The preparations they made to crash my exclusive party were incredibly pathetic and entirely shameless. Despite being completely broke and facing massive predatory loans from my secret shadow company, they managed to scrape together their very last remaining pennies to maintain their fake affluent image. Camille pawned her expensive wedding ring just to secure enough cash to rent a high-fashion evening gown. She spent hours doing her hair and makeup, trying desperately to look like a wealthy heiress instead of a completely ruined woman. Terrence and Preston went to a high-end tuxedo rental shop downtown. They maxed out a high-interest payday loan to afford premium velvet dinner jackets and polished leather shoes. They desperately wanted to look like successful, sophisticated businessmen who naturally belonged in a room full of billionaires. Terrence actively rehearsed his fake apology speech in front of the mirror, injecting manufactured tears into his voice as he practiced saying how much he missed his mother Vivian. It was a completely hollow performance. Chelsea used the last of her hidden emergency cash to rent a stunning floor-length silver gown. She practiced her devastated, loving daughter-in-law routine with chilling, sociopathic precision. She told the group that when they walked into the grand ballroom, they needed to immediately locate the highest concentration of news cameras and stage their emotional reunion right in the center of the flashing lights. To launch the foundation, I directed Arthur to organize an ultra-luxurious charity gala. We booked the grand ballroom of the most prestigious hotel in downtown Atlanta. I wanted the event to drip with undeniable wealth. We hired award-winning executive chefs and a world-renowned symphony orchestra. We decorated the sprawling ballroom with tens of thousands of imported white roses, which were Vivian's favorite flower. The guest list was a highly exclusive collection of powerful people. They felt incredibly smart. They felt like masterful manipulators who were about to successfully hijack my entire charitable legacy. They had absolutely no concept of the total, unmitigated destruction that was patiently waiting for them behind the heavy velvet curtains of my grand ballroom. They thought they were crashing a party to steal my remaining millions. They did not know they were actually dressing up in expensive rental tuxedos and high-fashion gowns just to attend their own very public execution. I sat in my luxury penthouse on the evening of the gala, looking closely at my reflection in the tall glass mirror. I was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over my entire body. The trap was perfectly set and the bait had been completely swallowed. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. It was finally time to pull the heavy iron lever and let the floor drop. The grand ballroom was transformed into a palace of luxury. Tens of thousands of imported white roses wrapped around the massive crystal chandeliers. The sweet scent filled the air, honoring the memory of my late wife, Vivian. An orchestra played soft classical music. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved gracefully through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne. The room was packed with the absolute elite of Atlanta. Senators, the city mayor, and highly successful business leaders mingled under the bright lights. I stood on the elevated balcony overlooking the main floor hidden in the shadows. I watched the heavy oak doors carefully. I had instructed my private security detail to leave that single entrance unguarded. I knew my greedy children were coming tonight. I could feel their desperate toxic energy approaching the building. Right on schedule, the heavy side doors pushed open. Terrence, Camille, Preston, and Chelsea strutted into the brightly lit room. They carried themselves with the breathtaking arrogance of people who genuinely believed they owned the entire world. Terrence was wearing a cheap rental tuxedo that was slightly too tight across his shoulders. Camille walked beside him, her neck bare, having pawned every piece of jewelry she owned to afford the dress. Preston marched forward wearing a velvet dinner jacket bought with a high-interest payday loan. Chelsea trailed behind wrapped in a silver floor-length gown, turning her head rapidly to locate the news cameras. They approached the reception desk where a young woman holding a digital guest list asked for their invitations. Chelsea stepped right up, invading the personal space of the young worker. Chelsea loudly declared they did not need physical invitations, announcing they were the direct family of the founder. The young woman looked confused, but I had already given strict, silent orders to the event staff. The worker smiled, unhooked the velvet rope, and allowed the parasites to walk directly into the heart of the gala. The sheer audacity of their behavior was truly something to behold. They were currently drowning in massive toxic debt, facing federal investigations, and living on the absolute brink of total financial destruction. But the very second they stepped onto the plush carpet, they immediately began acting like billionaire philanthropists. They separated and began aggressively working the room. Preston targeted a group of highly successful technology investors standing near the expansive bar. He leaned against the counter, swirling stolen champagne, and started talking loudly about imaginary digital startups and hedge fund strategies. He was actively trying to network, pretending he was a massive player in the financial industry. He laughed loudly at their jokes, desperate to secure new funding before federal agents raided his office. He had no idea that the men he was trying to impress were actually close personal friends of mine who already knew exactly who he was and what he had done to me. On the other side of the room, Chelsea was aggressively cornering the city mayor and a group of influential local politicians. She flashed her fake smile, loudly introducing herself as a primary director of the Vivian Sterling Foundation. She was actively trying to steal the credit for my $50 million charitable donation. She talked smoothly about how her family cared for the marginalized youth of Atlanta. It was absolutely sickening to watch her perform. This was the exact same woman who had completely forged real estate documents to steal a house and orchestrated a viral internet campaign calling me a violent, insane old man. She was standing in a rented dress, drinking free champagne, and boldly lying directly to the highest elected officials in the state. Camille and Terrence were busy hunting down local news crews, posing for the cameras, acting like the perfect loving children of a generous patriarch. I watched them perform their pathetic circus act for 20 minutes. I let them drink the champagne. I let them shake hands with politicians. I let them feel the intoxicating rush of validation. And then I slowly walked down the grand staircase from the balcony and stepped directly onto the main ballroom floor. The crowd naturally parted ways for me. People smiled and nodded respectfully as I walked past them. I walked straight toward the center of the room where Terrence, Camille, Preston, and Chelsea had regrouped. Terrence saw me first. The fake, confident smile instantly vanished from his face. All the color drained out of his cheeks. He nudged Preston nervously in the ribs. Preston spun around and his eyes widened in pure panic. Chelsea froze entirely, her champagne glass stopping halfway to her mouth. They braced themselves for a massive, violent confrontation. They fully expected me to scream at them or signal my security detail to drag them out. But I did not raise my voice. I did not call for the heavily armed guards. I walked right up to them with a calm and highly welcoming smile. "Good evening, my dear family," I said smoothly, my voice projecting just loud enough for the surrounding politicians and investors to hear clearly. "I am so incredibly glad you could make it to this wonderful celebration. We are honoring your mother tonight, and it simply would not be a real party without her beloved children here to witness it." Preston blinked rapidly, thrown off balance by my greeting. Chelsea exchanged a highly confused glance with Terrence. They had come here prepared to stage a massive fake apology scene to prevent me from throwing them out. They did not expect me to welcome them with open arms. Terrence cleared his throat, trying to regain his fake confidence. "We would never miss this." Dad, Terrence lied smoothly, forcing a tight smile. "We know we have had minor disagreements recently, but family is family. We are here to support you and honor Mom tonight." I nodded slowly, maintaining my perfect friendly facade. "I know exactly why you are here, Terrence," I replied, keeping my tone pleasant so the surrounding guests would suspect nothing. "Please follow me. I have reserved a very special place just for the four of you." I turned around and gestured for them to follow me through the crowded ballroom. We walked directly toward the very front of the room, right up to the edge of the illuminated stage. There was a large circular table positioned center in the front row. It was the absolute best table in the entire building. It was surrounded by news cameras, professional photographers, and powerful studio lighting. The table was dressed in white linen and covered in expensive crystal glassware. I pulled out a chair and gestured for Chelsea to sit down. "Please make yourselves completely comfortable," I told them politely. "You are the family of the founder. You deserve to be right here in the front row where everyone can see you clearly." Preston sat down next to Chelsea, completely unable to hide the massive, arrogant smirk forming on his face. Terrence and Camille quickly took their seats, looking around at the flashing cameras with delight. They fell for the trap completely. They did not see the executioners standing behind them. They only saw the flashing lights and the comfortable chairs. I watched their body language change. The panic and desperation were entirely gone. They leaned back in their plush seats, whispering quietly, completely convinced they had just won the ultimate victory. I could see the smug, toxic satisfaction radiating from their faces. They genuinely believed I was too embarrassed to cause a scene in front of the mayor. They thought I was too concerned about my new public image as a wealthy philanthropist to expose our dark family secrets. They thought my polite invitation to the VIP table was a clear signal of my complete surrender. I smiled down at them one last time. "Enjoy the champagne," I said softly. "The main presentation will begin shortly. I want you to pay close attention to the screens." I turned around and walked away from the VIP table, leaving them to bask in their false glory. I made my way towards the backstage area where my technical director was waiting by the audio and visual boards. I looked back at the ballroom floor. Preston was laughing, raising his glass in a toast with Terrence. Chelsea was fixing her hair for the cameras, and Camille was smiling brightly at the photographers. They were sitting exactly where I wanted them. They were perfectly positioned in the absolute center of the spotlight, surrounded by the most powerful people in the state of Georgia. They thought they were the honored guests of a royal banquet. They had no idea I had just strapped them directly into the electric chair, and the entire world was about to watch me pull the switch. The symphony orchestra brought their magnificent classical performance to an elegant close. The conversation among the wealthy guests faded into a respectful silence as the main ballroom lights dimmed. Bright, warm spotlights illuminated the massive stage at the front of the room. Behind the sleek acrylic podium stood a towering high-definition screen displaying the elegant gold logo of the Vivian Sterling Foundation. The mayor of Atlanta stepped up to the microphone to officially begin the evening proceedings. He spoke passionately about the future of the city and the incredible generosity of a man who had completely avoided the public spotlight until tonight. I stood quietly in the dark backstage area, watching the live feed on a dedicated high-definition production monitor. The camera operators frequently cut to the front row, focusing directly on the VIP table, where my biological children and my toxic in-laws were sitting comfortably. Preston and Chelsea were leaning back in their plush chairs, sipping premium champagne and whispering to each other with incredibly smug smiles on their faces. They looked entirely convinced that they had successfully infiltrated my fortress and completely secured their permanent place in high society. They only saw the bright flashing lights and the expensive crystal glassware, completely unaware of the devastating trap waiting for them. The mayor finished his opening remarks with a grand flourish. He looked out at the massive crowd and smiled warmly. Before we hear from the visionary founder himself, the mayor announced, his voice echoing powerfully through the massive speakers. "We have a very special opportunity to hear from the people who know him best. Please welcome to the stage the children of Desmond and Vivian Sterling." A massive wave of polite, enthusiastic applause washed over the grand ballroom. At the VIP table, Terrence and Camille exchanged a highly calculated look. They stood up simultaneously, smoothing the fabric of their cheap rental outfits. They plastered expressions of deep, humbling gratitude onto their faces and walked up the short flight of stairs to the main stage. They were entirely in their element. They absolutely loved the flashing lights and craved the public attention. They were completely thrilled to stand in front of the most powerful people in the state and pretend to be loving, devoted heirs. They completely forgot the fact that just a short time ago they had actively plotted to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. They only cared about the cameras pointing directly at their faces and the millions of dollars they desperately wanted to steal from my private accounts. Terrence reached the acrylic podium first. He gripped the edges with both hands, lowering his head for a brief, dramatic moment, as if trying to collect his emotional thoughts. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Terrence began, his voice perfectly modulated to sound both incredibly strong and deeply vulnerable. "My father, Desmond Sterling, is a man of absolute action. Growing up, I watched him work his fingers to the bone as a heavy machinery mechanic just to put food on our table. I watched him sacrifice every single personal comfort so that my sister and I could have the incredible opportunities he never had growing up in the segregated South." Terrence paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. He managed to produce a single, highly convincing tear that rolled down his right cheek. He wiped it away bravely, playing the role of the proud, deeply moved son to absolute perfection. The elite crowd was completely captivated by his performance. Women in expensive designer gowns looked on with genuine sympathy. Terrence continued his disgusting monologue, spinning a completely fabricated narrative about our incredibly tight-knit family bond. He told a fake story about how I used to stay up late helping him with his business plans, claiming I was his absolute best friend and his greatest mentor in the world. He spoke with such intense manufactured passion that a complete stranger would absolutely believe he worshipped the very ground I walked on. I watched him on the backstage production monitor, and my stomach turned with pure, unadulterated disgust. This was the exact same biological son who had stood silently in my living room while his wife forged my signature on a commercial real estate deed. He was the exact same man who cornered me in a dark grocery store parking lot, completely willing to let his arrogant brother-in-law physically beat an elderly man into total submission. Now he was standing in the bright, warm lights claiming I was his personal hero. He was actively painting an absolute masterpiece of deception right in front of the local media, firmly believing that he was successfully trapping me in a massive public corner he thought I could not possibly escape. Before Terrence could finish his elaborate closing statement, Camille stepped forward and smoothly pushed him slightly away from the microphone. She was not going to let her brother steal all the public sympathy. She grabbed the heavy metal microphone stand, her rented evening gown sparkling under the bright stage lights. "When we lost my beautiful mother Vivian 1 year ago, it felt like the light had completely gone out of our lives," Camille said, her voice shaking with expertly crafted sorrow. "But my father, this incredibly strong, resilient man, held our broken family together. He has always been our solid rock and our safe harbor in the darkest, most terrifying storms." Camille placed a delicate hand over her heart, closing her eyes to let the elite audience fully feel her emotional pain. She continued to lie with breathtaking sociopathic ease. She told the crowded room how much I loved my grandchildren, completely ignoring the fact that she had recently posted viral internet videos claiming I was intentionally a massive danger to society. She painted a beautiful, completely fake picture of a wealthy, united family standing together to change the world for the better. It was an absolute masterclass in severe psychological manipulation. She was utilizing the exact same fake victim strategy that Chelsea had successfully used on social media, but performing it live in front of the absolute highest echelon of Atlanta society. She wanted the billionaire technology investors to see her as a sophisticated, charitable heiress, entirely convinced that her dark criminal secrets were permanently buried in the past. I stood in the dark shadows just a few feet away from the heavy velvet stage curtains, listening to every single word they spoke. I heard the elite audience politely clapping, completely moved by the beautiful, heartwarming display of absolute family devotion. At the VIP table, Preston and Chelsea were clapping incredibly loudly. Preston leaned back and crossed his legs, looking incredibly proud of their masterful deception. He smirked at Chelsea, fully believing that they had successfully hijacked the entire narrative of the evening. They firmly believed they had just publicly secured their position as the rightful heirs to my remaining offshore fortune. They thought they had trapped me completely. They assumed that after such a highly publicized display of affection, I would be entirely forced to walk out onto the stage, hug them tightly in front of the flashing cameras, and officially welcome them back into my life. They thought my pride would completely prevent me from exposing the ugly, horrifying truth. The crowd erupted into a massive, sustained round of applause as Camille finished her beautiful speech and hugged Terrence tightly right in the center of the stage. The flashing lights of the press cameras illuminated their smiling faces, capturing their fake joy. The mayor returned to the acrylic podium beaming with genuine happiness. And now the mayor announced, his voice booming with intense excitement. Please welcome the man of the hour, the true visionary behind this foundation, Mr. Desmond Sterling. Desmond. The live symphony orchestra immediately began to play a triumphant, soaring piece of classical music. The entire ballroom stood up, offering a massive, deafening standing ovation before I even took a single step into the light. I took a deep, steady breath and smoothly adjusted the lapels of my custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out a small black remote control, holding it tightly in my right hand. The stage was perfectly set for their total destruction. The wealthy audience was completely captivated. The media cameras were rolling and broadcasting live to the entire city of Atlanta. My children were standing right there, in the center of the blinding spotlight, entirely convinced they had won the absolute final victory. They had built their towering skyscraper of lies to the absolute highest possible altitude. It was finally time to walk out. There look them dead in their greedy eyes and violently push them right off the edge into the dark, bottomless abyss. The deafening sound of a standing ovation washed over me as I stepped out from the dark shadows of the backstage area. The live symphony orchestra swelled to a magnificent crescendo, filling the grand ballroom with an incredibly triumphant melody. Hundreds of the most wealthy and powerful people in Atlanta were on their feet, clapping enthusiastically, their faces glowing under the warm golden light of the massive crystal chandeliers. I walked slowly and deliberately up the short flight of carpeted stairs toward the center of the main stage. I did not rush. I wanted to feel every single second of this highly anticipated moment. My custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo felt like a suit of heavy armor. In my right hand, completely hidden inside the pocket of my trousers, my fingers traced the smooth plastic edges of a small black remote control. It was the precise detonator for the massive explosive device I was about to drop directly onto my greedy family. As I reached the sleek acrylic podium, the applause slowly began to fade into a deeply respectful silence. The bright television studio lights momentarily blinded me, but I quickly adjusted my vision to see the massive sea of elite guests sitting before me. The mayor of the city gave me a warm, highly approving nod from his seat in the front row. Sitting just a few feet away from him at the exclusive VIP table were Preston and Chelsea. They were looking up at me with incredibly bright manufactured smiles. Terrence and Camille stood nearby, trying to look like the proudest children in the entire universe. They honestly believed their disgusting theatrical performance had worked perfectly. They thought they had successfully manipulated the narrative and trapped me in a public corner where I would be forced to play the role of the forgiving, loving patriarch. They thought the $25 million was completely guaranteed to be theirs. I rested my hands flat on the edges of the clear podium and looked out over the massive crowd. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began, keeping my voice incredibly smooth, deep, and perfectly resonant through the state-of-the-art sound system. We are gathered in this beautiful room to honor the magnificent legacy of my late wife, Vivian. She was a woman of extraordinary vision, boundless generosity, and absolute unyielding integrity. She believed that wealth was only meaningful if it was used to build a foundation of ultimate truth and profound justice. She despised deception above all other things. She believed that the light of truth must always shine brightly, no matter how uncomfortable or how painful that truth might be. I paused and looked directly down at the VIP table. The smiles on the faces of my children faltered for just a fraction of a second. A very subtle wave of confusion passed over Terrence. Chelsea shifted uncomfortably in her rented silver gown. They expected me to start talking about their beautiful speeches. They expected me to publicly thank them for their kind words. Instead, I was talking about deception. My daughter Camille and my son Terrence just shared some incredibly moving stories about our deep family bond. I continued, my voice echoing powerfully across the silent ballroom. They painted a beautiful, heartwarming picture of absolute loyalty and unconditional love. But as I said, Vivian valued the absolute truth above all else. And the truth is that words are very easy to fabricate. Anyone can stand in front of a camera and recite a beautiful script. Real truth is found in our actions when we think nobody is watching. Tonight, before we officially launch this $50 million foundation, I want to share a short visual presentation that perfectly illustrates the exact type of family loyalty my children just spoke about. I pulled my right hand out of my pocket. I raised the small black remote control high in the air so everyone in the room could see it clearly. I did not look at the screen behind me. I kept my eyes locked completely on the terrified, rapidly paling faces of my children in the front row. I pressed the primary button firmly. The warm golden lighting in the grand ballroom instantly plunged into complete darkness. The massive high-definition LED screen towering behind the podium flashed brightly to life. The elite audience fully expected to see a heartwarming slideshow of family photographs or a touching tribute video to my late wife. Instead, the screen displayed crisp high-definition security footage of the interior of my old working-class living room. The timestamp in the corner of the video clearly indicated it was recorded recently late at night. The state-of-the-art audio system in the ballroom was designed to amplify a full symphony orchestra. When the audio from the hidden security cameras kicked in, it boomed through the massive hall with absolutely terrifying volume. The screen showed Chelsea sitting at my old coffee table with a corrupt underground notary public. Preston was pacing back and forth across the carpet, sweating heavily. "Lock the old man in the psych ward so we can take the factory," Preston hissed through the massive speakers, his voice echoing violently across the stunned ballroom. "We do not have time to hunt down a senile old black man who refuses to cooperate with our business plans." A collective gasp of pure, unadulterated horror rippled through the hundreds of wealthy guests. The mayor sat frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. The local news cameras quickly pivoted from the stage directly toward the VIP table, desperately trying to capture the real-time reactions of my family. Terrence and Camille were completely paralyzed on the stage, their fake tears instantly drying up. Preston looked like he was about to physically vomit onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. Chelsea was shaking her head rapidly, whispering the word "no" over and over again in pure panic. The video on the massive screen continued to play mercilessly. The audience watched in total silent shock as Chelsea pulled out a forged transfer of deed. They watched her carefully practice my signature on a scrap piece of paper before smoothly forging my exact handwriting on the official commercial real estate document. The loud, sharp clack of the corrupt notary stamping the fraudulent deed echoed through the grand hall. The wealthy investors and corporate leaders in the audience looked at Chelsea and Preston with absolute disgust. The screen faded to black before playing the exact viral social media video Chelsea posted recently. The 50-foot screen showed her fake crying face claiming I was incredibly violent and severely demented. But my technical director had brilliantly edited the video. After Chelsea cried about my supposed insanity, the screen split in half. The other side played the hidden camera footage of her laughing and drinking cheap wine while celebrating the massive real estate forgery. The sheer level of toxic hypocrisy was almost difficult to comprehend. The politicians now looked at Chelsea as if she was highly contagious. Then the final piece of evidence played across the massive screen. It was the crystal-clear security footage from the dimly lit grocery store parking lot. The visual of a wealthy white hedge fund manager aggressively shoving a 72-year-old black man against a car hood was incredibly powerful. "You listen to me very closely, you lucky old thug." Preston spat, his voice dripping with intense malicious racism, amplified for the entire elite society of Atlanta to hear clearly. "You do not deserve that prime industrial real estate. If you go to the police, I swear to God, I will personally beat you within an inch of your miserable life." Women in the audience were covering their mouths in horror. Several prominent business leaders were shaking their heads in deep, profound anger. The screen faded to a solid, stark white background displaying only the elegant gold logo of the Vivian Sterling Foundation. The bright, warm spotlight slowly illuminated the main stage once again. The deafening silence that filled the grand ballroom was heavier and more suffocating than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. Nobody moved. Nobody clapped. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the state simply stared at the four individuals sitting in the front row and standing on the stage. I leaned forward into the clear acrylic podium. I looked directly down at my children. Their fake, hypocritical masks were entirely destroyed. Their carefully constructed narrative was completely burned to the ground. They were totally exposed as the greedy, manipulative, violent predators they truly were. "That is the absolute truth about my family," I said calmly into the microphone, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. "They did not come here tonight to honor their mother. They came here to manipulate the public and steal a massive fortune. But true, absolute corporate power simply does not ever reward such violent betrayal." The silence in the grand ballroom was so incredibly heavy, you could hear the soft hum of the crystal chandeliers above us. Hundreds of wealthy and influential people simply stared at the four individuals who had just been exposed on the massive screen. Preston was breathing in short, rapid gasps. The arrogant smirk permanently plastered across his face was completely gone. The blood had drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin sickly and pale. He looked like a man falling through empty air, waiting for the devastating impact. Chelsea was sitting frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the dark screen. Her fake tears were nowhere to be found in this moment of pure terror. Terrence and Camille stood paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their public humiliation. Preston finally snapped out of his frozen state. His base survival instincts kicked into high gear. He knew that the video evidence of real estate forgery and elder abuse was enough to send him to prison. He did not care about his wife or my children. He only cared about saving his own life. He abruptly pushed his chair backward. The chair scraped loudly against the polished floor, cutting through the dead silence. Preston turned away from the stage and began to quickly walk toward the heavy oak exit doors at the back of the grand ballroom. He kept his head down, desperately trying to avoid any direct eye contact with the disgusted politicians and elite bankers he had just been trying to impress. He was walking as fast as his legs could carry him, pushing past the waiters in their crisp white jackets. He was quite literally attempting to completely flee the terrifying scene of his own highly deserved public execution. But I had meticulously planned every single second of this evening. I was not going to let the rat simply scurry away into the dark night. I leaned closely into the clear acrylic podium and spoke directly into the microphone. "Where exactly do you think you are going right now, Preston?" I asked him, my voice echoing very loudly across the massive, silent room. "You came all the way here to celebrate your brilliant corporate success. You should really stay for the grand finale." Preston completely ignored my voice. He broke into a desperate, pathetic run. He reached the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom and grabbed the brass handles, pushing with all of his physical strength. But the doors did not open outward. Instead, they were pulled open from the outside with incredible forceful authority. Preston stumbled backward in pure shock as a long line of serious men and women wearing dark suits and heavy tactical windbreakers marched directly into the grand ballroom. The bright yellow letters printed across the backs of their jackets clearly identified them as federal agents. There were senior investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission walking shoulder to shoulder with heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They completely blocked the only exit, trapping Preston inside the brightly lit room. Preston stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror. He slowly backed away from the federal agents, raising his shaking hands into the air. The elite crowd of politicians and corporate leaders watched in stunned silence as the highly coordinated federal ambush unfolded right in front of their eyes. I stood perfectly still on the beautifully illuminated main stage, looking out over the truly incredible scene before me. I brought my mouth very close to the microphone, ensuring that my voice was the only sound echoing through the massive space. The video evidence you all just witnessed was only a tiny fraction of the horrifying truth I announced to the silent room. My son-in-law Preston likes to pretend he is a highly successful and brilliant hedge fund manager. He likes to wear expensive velvet dinner jackets and look down upon the hard-working people of this city. But Preston is nothing more than a desperate, pathetic criminal. I looked directly at Preston, who was trembling violently in the center of the room, completely surrounded by the elite society he desperately wanted to join. I recently deployed a highly elite team of forensic accountants to conduct a deep shadow audit of his entire corporate enterprise, I explained smoothly. The documents revealed that Preston has been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from his wealthy clients for the past 4 years. He secretly funneled the stolen corporate capital into highly volatile, high-risk offshore accounts to easily fund his lavish lifestyle and to desperately hide his massive, catastrophic trading losses. The prominent politicians and the wealthy investors in the audience immediately began to murmur angrily among themselves. Many of them knew Preston professionally, and the revelation of his massive hedge fund embezzlement was an absolute shockwave. When Preston realized the federal government was closing in on his crimes, I continued, he desperately needed a massive infusion of untraceable cash to cover his tracks. That is exactly why he aggressively forged my personal signature on a massive commercial real estate deed. He was entirely willing to throw me into a locked psychiatric ward just to steal my property and save himself from a federal penitentiary. I officially handed over the complete unredacted forensic audit directly to the federal authorities exactly 3 days ago. I stated very clearly to the room. They have been quietly waiting outside this ballroom all evening for the perfect moment to execute their arrest warrants. 2 massive senior agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation suddenly stepped forward and forcefully grabbed Preston by his trembling arms. Preston did not put up a physical fight. He was completely drained of all his arrogant energy. He was sobbing loudly right in the middle of the grand ballroom. His broad shoulders were shaking violently as the trained agents aggressively twisted his weak arms far behind his back. The loud, sharp click of cold steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the silent room. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The elite crowd watched in absolute disgust as the federal agents patted down his cheap rented tuxedo, searching his pockets for weapons or contraband. He had spent the entire evening trying to schmooze with the mayor and the billionaire bankers pretending to be their equal. Now he was standing before them in a rented suit, crying like a terrified child with his hands chained securely behind his back. His entire professional reputation was entirely vaporized into thin air. His fake sophisticated mask was permanently destroyed. He was completely exposed as a desperate thieving fraud. The federal agents began to physically march him toward the exit doors. Preston turned his head and looked back at Chelsea, who was still sitting frozen at the VIP table. He cried out to her, begging her to call a lawyer. Chelsea did not even look at him. She stared blankly at the floor, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic realization that her luxurious life was entirely over. Her husband was going to federal prison, and she was completely alone. I watched the heavy oak doors swing completely shut as the federal agents forcefully removed Preston from the massive building forever. The grand ballroom remained incredibly quiet. I looked down at Terrence and Camille, who were still standing frozen on the edge of the stage. They were shivering as if they were standing in the freezing rain. They had just witnessed their arrogant, aggressive leader get completely dismantled and hauled away in chains. They finally understood that they were completely outmatched. They had tried to play a ruthless game of corporate warfare against a man they thought was a stupid retired mechanic. They did not realize until this exact moment that I was a master strategist holding an $80 million war chest. I leaned into the microphone one last time. True power does not scream in a dark parking garage, I said, my voice carrying a cold, heavy weight. True power operates in the bright light of day, using the absolute truth as its greatest weapon. The Vivian Sterling Foundation will use its $50 million endowment to support people who actually possess the honor and the integrity that my family completely lacks. I slowly stepped away from the clear acrylic podium and calmly walked off the main stage. The elite audience immediately erupted into another massive standing ovation. They clapped loudly for the swift, brutal justice they had just witnessed. Chelsea, Terrence, and Camille slowly backed away from the bright stage lights and quietly slipped out the side doors, fleeing into the dark night. They were entirely defeated. Their massive $25 million payday was completely dead. But the true horror of their situation had not even fully arrived yet. They had no idea that I still legally owned their massive predatory loans and their luxury homes. The massive corporate trap was finally sprung perfectly today. The morning after the catastrophic charity gala, the city of Atlanta was completely buzzing with the shocking news. I woke up in my luxury penthouse suite feeling incredibly rested. I drank my black coffee and watched the morning news broadcasts. The media was aggressively covering Preston's massive federal arrest and the spectacular launch of the $50 million Vivian Sterling Foundation. But while I was enjoying my quiet morning, my biological children and my treacherous daughter-in-law were experiencing an absolute living nightmare. Preston was sitting inside a cold federal holding cell facing severe embezzlement charges, completely trapped today. His bail was set at an astronomical amount because he was deemed a massive flight risk. Chelsea was completely panicking. She needed millions of dollars in liquid cash immediately to bail her husband out of federal custody and to hire a team of elite criminal defense attorneys. Terrence and Camille were equally terrified. They knew that if Preston went down, he would absolutely drag them all down with him to reduce his own prison sentence. Their only remaining hope for total salvation was the $25 million commercial real estate closing scheduled for that exact early Friday morning right. They were clinging to a completely delusional fantasy. They genuinely believed that massive global megacorporations operated in completely isolated silos. They thought the real estate division of Titanica Corporation would be entirely unaware of the highly publicized charity gala from the previous night. They desperately hoped they could simply walk into the corporate boardroom, hand over the forged transfer of deed, collect the $25 million wire transfer, and immediately flee the country before the federal agents could connect the real estate fraud to Preston's existing criminal charges. It was a pathetic plan, built on absolute desperation entirely. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, Chelsea, Terrence, and Camille rushed into the immaculate glass and steel lobby of the Titanica Corporation regional headquarters. They did not look like the arrogant, confident, high society elites they pretended to be just 12 hours ago. They looked incredibly haggard, completely exhausted, and entirely terrified. Chelsea was wearing large, dark sunglasses to hide her swollen red eyes. Terrence was sweating profusely through his wrinkled dress shirt. Camille was shaking nervously as they rode the private executive elevator up to the top floor. They were escorted into a massive, pristine boardroom quietly. The room featured a long, polished mahogany table surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the downtown financial district. 2 junior corporate attorneys were already sitting at the table, organizing thick stacks of legal closing documents. Chelsea immediately went on the aggressive offensive. She slammed her expensive designer purse onto the polished mahogany wood and demanded immediate service. "We are in a massive rush this morning," Chelsea announced, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. "We have all the required paperwork right here, neatly organized and completely ready to go forward today. Completely. The toxic waste lien has been completely cleared and paid in full. We have the official notarized transfer of deed officially granting us total ownership of the factory property. We need you to initiate the $25 million wire transfer into our primary accounts immediately. We do not have time to sit around and review standard boilerplate contracts." Terrence pulled the forged deed from his leather briefcase and slid it across the table toward the junior attorneys. He was trying to project confidence, but his hands were shaking so violently that the heavy paper fluttered against the dark wood. "Just sign the final authorization," Terrence pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "The deal is completely clean. The regional director already approved the purchase price last week. Let us just finish this transaction so we can all move on with our lives." The 2 junior attorneys did not touch the forged document. They simply looked at each other and then looked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom. "We do not have the executive authority to authorize a $25 million wire transfer," the first attorney stated, calmly adjusting his extremely expensive silk blue tie smoothly. "The Supreme Executive Director of the Regional Real Estate Division must personally inspect the final property deed and manually authorize the release of the corporate funds. He is waiting in the adjacent office right now. I will let him know you are ready to proceed." Chelsea crossed her arms over her chest and tapped her foot impatiently against the carpet. "Fine," she snapped angrily. "Go get your boss right now. We are not leaving this room until the money is officially resting in our bank accounts." They sat in the plush leather chairs, staring greedily at the blank, empty forms. They were holding their breath, completely convinced they were only seconds away from securing their absolute financial salvation. They thought they were about to walk out of that building as multimillionaires. The heavy wooden double doors at the back of the massive boardroom slowly clicked open. The sound echoed loudly through the quiet glass room. Chelsea, Terrence, and Camille all turned their heads simultaneously, expecting to see a random wealthy white corporate executive walk through the heavy frame. Instead, I walked through the heavy wooden doors. I was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray business suit and white shirt. My wealth management attorney, Arthur Vance, walked closely right behind me carrying a sleek, silver briefcase. I walked with the slow, measured, heavy steps of a man who owned the entire building. The air in the boardroom instantly turned to solid ice. The sheer, absolute impossibility of my physical presence in that specific corporate office completely shattered their minds. Terrence gasped loudly, clutching his chest as if he had just been violently shot. Camille covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated horror. Chelsea physically recoiled, falling backward into her plush leather chair, entirely absolutely terrified. All the color drained from her face completely, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. I did not say a single word as I calmly walked to the very head of the polished mahogany table. I pulled out the oversized executive leather chair and sat down, folding my hands neatly in front of me. Arthur Vance stood directly to my right, opening his silver briefcase. I looked down the long table at the three pathetic, sweating individuals who had actively tried to destroy my life. Their brains were desperately trying to process the horrifying visual information in front of them. "What are you doing here?" Chelsea finally whispered, her voice completely devoid of all her usual arrogant venom. "This is a highly secure private corporate meeting. You cannot be in this building. Security is going to arrest you." I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile that did not reach my eyes. "Security is not going to arrest me, Chelsea," I replied, my voice echoing powerfully through the sleek glass room. "Security works directly for me. You see, when you operate in the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, you really should conduct a thorough background check extremely carefully initially. You must know the people you are selling your stolen property to. Titanica Corporation is indeed a massive global conglomerate, but they operate through decentralized regional divisions. When I discovered your brilliant plan to sell my factory to this specific corporate branch, I decided to make a very aggressive financial investment. 2 days ago, my offshore private equity trust completely purchased the majority shares of this entire regional division. I paused, letting the absolute devastating weight of my words completely crush their remaining hope. "I am the supreme executive director of this company," I stated firmly, clearly, and very loudly. "I am the absolute boss. You did not come here today to sell a property to a faceless megacorporation. You came here to sell my own stolen property directly back to me." Terrence let out a loud, agonizing groan and buried his face completely in his trembling hands. He finally understood the absolute inescapable depth of the massive financial trap they had walked blindly into. Camille began to weep softly, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. Chelsea simply stared at me, her jaw trembling violently. Arthur Vance reached into his silver briefcase and pulled important documents. He pulled out a thick stack of heavily stamped federal documents. He placed them directly onto the mahogany table right next to their pathetic forged deed. I picked up the forged document they had just presented to my junior attorneys. I looked at my perfectly copied signature at the bottom of the page. "You forged this document in my own living room," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "You paid a corrupt underground notary public to place a fake state seal on it. The deal is completely dead, and your luxurious lives are entirely over forever." Exactly 14 days had passed since the morning the county sheriffs permanently locked my treacherous children out of their luxury homes. 14 days is a short amount of time for a man living in a peaceful penthouse, but it is an absolute eternity when you are falling rapidly down a dark hole. My private investigators provided me with a detailed report regarding their exact movements and their current miserable living conditions. I sat in my comfortable leather chair and read the heavy dossier while drinking my morning coffee. The first major update was regarding my arrogant son-in-law, Preston. His highly expensive criminal defense attorneys had completely failed to save him. The federal judge looked at the massive mountain of irrefutable evidence involving massive hedge fund embezzlement and severe real estate forgery. The judge officially deemed Preston a severe flight risk and a massive danger to the community. He was completely denied bail. The arrogant, wealthy white hedge fund manager who used to drink premium champagne and look down upon working-class black men was currently sitting inside a freezing cold federal holding cell wearing a cheap, bright orange prison jumpsuit. He was entirely trapped behind thick steel bars, eating terrible institutional food and facing decades in a federal penitentiary. While Preston was locked in a concrete cage, my daughter-in-law Chelsea, my biological son Terrence, and my daughter Camille were experiencing their own unique brand of absolute unmitigated hell. The three of them were currently crammed into a single, incredibly filthy room at a cheap roadside motel located right off the loud, busy interstate highway. It was the exact kind of miserable, decaying establishment that rented tiny, damp rooms by the hour to desperate, transient strangers. The faded floral wallpaper was peeling away from the water-damaged walls in long, ugly strips. The heavily stained industrial carpet smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke, old mildew, and cheap, toxic cleaning chemicals. A massive broken neon sign buzzed loudly right outside their single cracked window, casting a harsh, blinking red light across their cramped living space every few seconds. They were forced to sleep in awkward shifts on two sagging, highly uncomfortable beds. Restful sleep was completely impossible. The cheap, dirty mattresses were heavily infested with aggressive bedbugs. Every single morning, my previously wealthy children woke up with angry red bite marks completely covering their arms and their legs. Chelsea spent hours sitting on the edge of the filthy porcelain bathtub, crying softly as she aggressively scratched her irritated skin. She was a deeply superficial woman who used to spend thousands of dollars every single month on luxury skincare routines and expensive imported cosmetics. Now she was washing her face with a cracked bar of cheap motel soap and drying her shaking hands on a stiff, scratchy towel. Terrence sat on the dirty floor in the dark corner of the room, staring blankly at the rotting wooden baseboards. He was wearing the exact same designer suit he had worn on the day of his violent eviction, but the expensive fabric was now heavily stained and terribly wrinkled. His premium leather shoes were completely scuffed and covered in thick highway dirt. He looked like a completely broken, entirely defeated man. Their financial ruin was absolute and totally inescapable. When the federal authorities officially launched the massive criminal investigation into the forged commercial property deed, they immediately ordered the banks to freeze all of their remaining personal accounts. Their high-limit credit cards were instantly declined everywhere they went. They had exactly $34 in loose cash between the three of them. They had to pool their remaining coins together just to survive on cheap, greasy fast food and stale convenience store bread. But the absolute final catastrophic blow fell directly onto Chelsea earlier that week. The State Real Estate Commission had launched an immediate emergency review of her professional conduct after the viral public exposure at the charity gala. Because she was caught on crystal-clear high-definition video, actively practicing and forging a signature on a massive commercial real estate deed, the state board permanently revoked her real estate license. She was officially banned from ever practicing real estate in the state of Georgia again. Her entire professional identity was entirely vaporized. Extreme poverty and intense physical hunger will quickly destroy any fake alliances built entirely on toxic greed. The heavy, suffocating tension inside the cramped, freezing motel room finally boiled over into outright psychological violence on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The private investigator had managed to place a tiny listening device near their window, capturing their entire miserable breakdown. Terrence was pacing back and forth across the narrow space between the two sagging beds, furiously tapping the cracked screen of his mobile phone, cursing loudly about the lack of a stable internet connection. Chelsea was sitting on the edge of the mattress, glaring at him with pure, unadulterated hatred in her tired, bloodshot eyes. Chelsea suddenly hissed at Terrence, telling him that this entire catastrophic nightmare was completely his fault. Her voice was dripping with intense venom and deep resentment. She screamed that he was a pathetic failure who could not even borrow money correctly. She said that if Terrence and Preston had not signed that massive predatory loan with the anonymous offshore company, they would still be living comfortably in their beautiful luxury homes. Terrence stopped pacing and spun around to face her. His face turned bright red with defensive, explosive rage. He aggressively stepped toward her and shouted that she had no right to blame him for anything. Terrence loudly reminded Chelsea that she was the licensed real estate professional who confidently told them the forged signature would easily hold up in a court of law. He screamed that she was the incredibly arrogant fool who brought the fake deed directly to the Titanica Corporation boardroom, completely triggering the massive federal trap. He called her a massive, incompetent failure who could not even steal a dirty, abandoned factory without completely destroying their entire lives. Chelsea stood up abruptly, her fists clenched tightly at her sides, looking like she was completely ready to physically attack him. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her highly abusive voice echoing loudly through the thin motel walls and out into the wet parking lot. She yelled that she was not the one who begged the old man for grocery money while pretending to be a self-made technology visionary on the internet. She called Terrence an absolute parasitic joke who dragged all of them down into the filthy gutter because he desperately wanted to play a high-stakes financial game he simply did not possess the intelligence to actually understand. The screaming match escalated incredibly rapidly into a vicious, highly toxic verbal war. They violently tore into each other, ripping away years of fake, polite family smiles and exposing their absolute mutual disgust. They blamed each other for the failed commercial real estate buyout, the highly fraudulent loans, and the humiliating public exposure at the charity gala. They pointed shaking fingers over the corrupt underground notary public and the massive social media scandal that backfired so spectacularly. They were exactly like starving, desperate rats trapped inside a dark metal cage, aggressively cannibalizing each other just to survive one more miserable day. Camille watched them scream from her spot on the dirty floor, completely depleted of her usual vanity and superficial arrogance. She hugged her knees tightly against her chest and began to wail loudly, begging them to stop screaming. Camille cried out that fault did not matter anymore because the money was completely gone and the houses were permanently seized. They had absolutely nothing left to fight over. Terrence and Chelsea stopped yelling and looked down at Camille. The bitter reality of their situation was completely undeniable. They were defeated by their catastrophic, greedy choices. Camille whispered through her heavy tears that they were going to die in the cold. She told them they could not afford another single night in that terrible room because the motel manager had already threatened to kick them out tomorrow morning when their final cash payment declined. She said they were going to be sleeping on the cold concrete sidewalk exactly like the homeless people they used to completely ignore and actively despise on the downtown streets. Terrence slowly shook his head, placing his hands flat against the cold, dirty wall. His knees shook slightly from extreme physical weakness and a total lack of proper daily nutrition. Terrence looked at his sister and his sister-in-law with a look of total agonizing defeat. He told them they were not going to sleep on the street. He said there was only one person in this entire world who could stop this absolute nightmare. He whispered that there was only one man who possessed the absolute financial power to turn the lights back on and save them from starving to death. The bleak morning arrived with a violently cold storm completely covering the city of Atlanta. The sky was a heavy, dark gray, pouring freezing rain onto the cracked pavement of the motel parking lot. Terrence, Camille, and Chelsea were officially out of time entirely. The motel manager pounded on their thin wooden door, completely demanding they vacate the room immediately. They had absolutely no money to negotiate and no valuable items left to pawn anywhere. They were completely starving and entirely broken. Chelsea looked at the stained mirror and saw the hollow, terrifying reality of her ruined life staring back at her. Her arrogant pride was finally completely crushed under the absolute weight of sheer survival. Terrence told them they had to go to the corporate headquarters of my private equity firm. They had to swallow every single ounce of their toxic pride and physically beg me for mercy. They had no luxury cars to drive and absolutely no money for a taxi. They had to walk the entire distance. They stepped out of the filthy motel room and directly into the freezing torrential rain. The heavy icy drops soaked through their thin wrinkled clothing, almost instantly chilling their bodies completely to the bone. The journey from the cheap roadside motel to the wealthy downtown financial district was exactly 7 miles. It was a grueling physical punishment for 3 arrogant people who had not eaten a proper warm meal in an entire week. They walked very slowly along the side of the busy highway, shivering violently as large commercial trucks sped past them, completely spraying their freezing bodies with dirty, wet street water. Chelsea was wearing cheap, thin shoes that provided absolutely no protection against the deep freezing puddles forming rapidly on the side of the cracked, broken road. Her feet were completely numb, and her legs were shaking from severe physical exhaustion. Camille walked with her head down, crying silently as the cold rain mixed heavily with her bitter tears. Terrence led the pathetic, desperate march, looking like a completely defeated shell of the highly arrogant corporate executive he falsely pretended to be. They walked for over 3 agonizing hours through the freezing downpour. They eventually entered the wealthy downtown district where they used to confidently shop for expensive luxury brands and dine at highly exclusive 5-star restaurants. The wealthy business executives, walking rapidly under large black umbrellas, looked at them with absolute pure disgust and total contempt. My completely ruined children were officially the exact same miserable homeless people they had always mocked and entirely ignored in their previous comfortable lives. They finally reached the towering glass skyscraper that served as my primary corporate absolute headquarters. The towering glass building was a massive modern monument to absolute corporate power and unyielding financial control. They hesitated directly outside the heavy revolving doors, shivering violently and completely terrified of the massive corporate beast they were about to willingly walk into. Terrence finally pushed through the thick glass doors and led them slowly into the immaculate, pristine, white marble lobby. The warm climate-controlled indoor air hit their freezing wet bodies, but it offered absolutely no comfort whatsoever. They were dripping dirty, freezing rainwater all over the incredibly expensive, highly polished marble floors. The sharply dressed security guards immediately stepped forward, fully intending to violently throw them back out into the freezing storm without any hesitation. But I had already clearly instructed my head of security to completely expect their pathetic, desperate arrival today. The armed guards abruptly stopped and simply stared at their ruined clothing with absolute disgust. The head of security silently gestured directly toward a private express elevator entirely reserved for supreme executive corporate leadership. Terrence, Chelsea, and Camille walked slowly into the sleek glass elevator, completely surrounded by the overwhelming silent power of my absolute corporate domain. The heavy steel doors slid shut, and they rapidly ascended 80 floors high into the dark, stormy sky. The fast vertical ride was completely silent, except for the incredibly loud sound of their shallow, panicked breathing and the soft, continuous dripping of rainwater hitting the pristine floor. The elevator doors finally opened directly into my massive top-floor executive suite. The thick, plush, deep gray carpet completely silenced their wet, heavy footsteps as they walked slowly down the long, immaculate corridor directly toward my corner office. My massive office featured beautiful, floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering a truly breathtaking panoramic view of the dark, rainy, sprawling city. I was sitting very comfortably behind my massive, dark, solid mahogany desk, slowly drinking a warm cup of premium dark roast coffee. The heavy wooden double doors were already standing wide open, waiting for them. They slowly walked into the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of my office and completely stopped right in the absolute center of the massive room. They looked absolutely horrific and deeply pathetic. Their previously expensive clothes were completely soaked, entirely ruined, and plastered tightly to their violently shaking, starving bodies. They smelled exactly like a terrible, foul mixture of cheap motel soap and wet, dirty asphalt. I did not stand up to greet them at all. I did not politely offer them a warm, dry towel or a comfortable leather chair to sit in. I simply rested my hands flat on my pristine, polished wooden desk and stared at them with a look of absolute freezing indifference. The incredibly heavy, suffocating silence in the massive glass office stretched out for a very long, agonizing time, actively, entirely forcing them to deeply confront the immense, terrifying gravity of their massive personal failures. Suddenly, Terrence took a very shaky, desperate step forward toward my heavy desk. His incredibly weak, starving legs completely gave out directly beneath him. He dropped directly down to his wet knees right there on the plush gray carpet. He did not trip, and he absolutely did not stumble accidentally. He willingly collapsed downward in an act of total, pathetic, absolute, unmitigated surrender. The very second Terrence hit the floor, the two miserable women completely and immediately followed his exact lead. Camille fell heavily to her wet knees right beside her broken brother, burying her face deep in her dirty, shaking hands and sobbing incredibly loudly and entirely uncontrollably in the quiet, massive, beautiful corporate room. Chelsea sank slowly down to the ground, bowing her wet head in absolute, total, complete disgrace. The three greedy, highly arrogant adults who had actively, maliciously plotted to permanently lock me inside a terrible state psychiatric ward were now physically prostrating themselves directly before me, exactly like starving, miserable peasants, desperately begging a wealthy king for a single tiny crust of stale bread. Terrence choked back a loud, agonizing sob, his voice cracking and breaking with intense, pathetic, complete desperation. "Dad, we are so incredibly sorry," Terrence cried out loudly, heavy tears streaming rapidly down his wet, dirty, freezing face. "We were completely, absolutely wrong about everything we ever did. We made a horrible, massive, catastrophic mistake, and we are completely paying for it right now. Please, Dad, you have to absolutely save us from this completely terrible, absolute nightmare before we entirely die out there in the freezing rain." I took another slow, deliberate, highly satisfying sip of my warm black coffee. I did not say a single comforting word to him. I wanted him to completely pour out every single ounce of his deeply toxic pride right onto the floor of my pristine office. Camille suddenly lifted her wet head, her face completely soaked with freezing rain and desperate, pathetic tears. "Daddy, please!" she wailed incredibly loudly, completely, entirely abandoning any remaining tiny shred of her fake, superficial vanity. "We have absolutely nothing left in the entire world. We are sleeping in a filthy, disgusting motel completely infested with hungry, biting insects. We are completely starving to death, and we absolutely cannot find any jobs anywhere in this entire massive city. We will do absolutely anything you ever want us to do. We will scrub the dirty floors of this building every single solitary night forever starting today. We will completely, absolutely pay back every single tiny penny we owe your offshore company. Just please stop the massive corporate foreclosures and give us our normal, comfortable lives back right now. Chelsea was openly, violently weeping on the floor, completely, totally shattered by her massive public and absolute financial destruction.
Desmond, I am desperately begging you.
Chelsea sobbed loudly, her voice incredibly high-pitched and entirely, absolutely broken. Terrence brought his shaking hands tightly together exactly as if he was actively, intensely praying to a massive, powerful religious deity. Dad, we know we completely hurt you, but we are your family. Terrence pleaded desperately, his loud voice echoing strongly against the thick glass windows. We are your own blood. Blood is thicker than water, Dad. You cannot just leave your own biological blood to slowly freeze and die. Please give us a second chance to be a real family. I sat behind my massive desk, unmoved by the pathetic display of manufactured grief unfolding on my carpet. My biological children, Terrence and Camille, along with my toxic daughter-in-law, Chelsea, were violently sobbing on their knees. They desperately pleaded for their luxurious lives to be restored. They weaponized the concept of family blood, hoping my heart would soften at the sight of their physical suffering. I looked down at them with freezing indifference. The silence in my corner office was incredibly heavy. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the shivering creatures begging at my feet. I only felt the profound clarity of a man who had successfully removed a deadly cancer from his life. You threw me away exactly like a piece of worthless garbage when you completely believed I was a poor, helpless old man, I said, my voice perfectly flat. You forged real estate documents and plotted to lock your own father inside a miserable psychiatric ward simply to steal a decaying factory. You smiled and celebrated while you intentionally planned my destruction. You did not care about biological blood when you stood in the cold basement and threatened to erase my existence. You only care about blood today because your bank accounts are empty and you are completely freezing in the rain. Blood does not excuse betrayal. Blood only makes your terrifying greed that much more disgusting. Terrence gasped loudly, shaking his head in pure panic. He tried to crawl closer to my desk, but the freezing authority radiating from my eyes stopped him. I opened the top drawer of my solid wood desk and pulled out 3 thin manila folders. I casually tossed the folders directly onto the polished mahogany surface, letting them slide right to the edge. Terrence and Chelsea immediately stared at the folders with wide, starving eyes. They genuinely believed I was handing them a magical financial lifeline. They thought I was giving them lucrative corporate consulting contracts or writing them a massive check. Open them, I commanded, smoothly leaning back into my plush leather chair. Terrence reached up with shaking hands and grabbed the top folder. He opened it eagerly, his bloodshot eyes rapidly scanning the black ink printed on the white paper. The tiny spark of desperate hope in his eyes was instantly extinguished and violently replaced by absolute, unadulterated horror. Chelsea and Camille leaned over his wet shoulder to read the legal documents, and they immediately began to weep even louder. The papers were not lucrative corporate contracts. They were standard entry-level employment applications for the city sanitation department. You came here begging for a way to simply survive the winter, I told them, my voice echoing coldly across the glass room. You want to eat warm food and sleep under a dry roof. Then you can start by putting on a heavy uniform and cleaning up the actual physical garbage in the city streets. It is the absolute only honest manual labor you are qualified to perform. You will earn the exact minimum wage and spend the rest of your miserable lives picking up the trash you created yourselves. Chelsea fell backward onto the carpet, shaking her head aggressively. She cried out loudly that she was a sophisticated woman who absolutely could not scrub dirty streets. Camille wailed that I was being cruel to my own flesh and blood. Terrence begged me to reconsider asking for just a tiny fraction of my massive estate. You are holding out desperate hope for a future payday that simply does not exist, I stated firmly. Yesterday afternoon, I finalized my official estate planning with my wealth management attorney. In my ironclad legal will, the names Terrence, Camille, Preston, and Chelsea do not appear a single time. I have explicitly legally disinherited all of you forever. You are permanently erased from my will and my charitable legacy. If I pass away tomorrow or 20 years from now, you will absolutely never receive a single penny of my fortune. You are completely dead to me." I did not wait for them to process my devastating verdict. I raised my right hand into the quiet air and snapped my fingers twice. The heavy double doors of my office swung open. 4 armed elite security operators marched into the room. Before my children could register what was happening, the operators grabbed them aggressively by their soaking collars. Terrence and Camille were hoisted into the air. Chelsea was dragged forcefully to her feet, kicking and screaming in agonizing despair. They cried out my name, begging for mercy, as the massive guards physically dragged them backward across the plush carpet and entirely out of my beautiful corporate sanctuary. The heavy doors slammed permanently shut, cutting off their pathetic wailing forever. The absolute total peaceful silence that returned to my large executive office was incredibly beautiful. I slowly stood up from my heavy desk and walked over to the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The freezing rain continued to heavily pour down over the entire sprawling city of Atlanta. I looked out over the massive, glowing skyline, feeling completely at peace. I had successfully protected my beautiful late wife's incredible legacy and permanently destroyed the toxic parasites who tried to steal it. I had completely won the final financial war, securing my family legacy forever and entirely restoring true, absolute justice. Family is not simply granted by the blood flowing through your veins. It must be continuously earned through loyalty, unwavering gratitude, and deep mutual respect. When blinding toxic greed overrides basic human decency, the sacred title of family is permanently revoked. True power does not reside in possessing a massive bank account, but in the quiet, stoic discipline of holding toxic individuals entirely accountable for their ruthless actions. Never weaponize your own personal compassion to protect parasites who would eagerly destroy your life for $1. Ultimately, absolute peace is found in walking away with your unshakable dignity perfectly intact. If you enjoyed this satisfying story of absolute justice, please make sure to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how Desmond handled his treacherous family, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories.